The blow didn't come with a warning. There was no theatrical wind-up, no shouted threat to telegraph the movement. There was only the sudden, violent displacement of air and the sickening, hollow thud of glass meeting bone. Derek Voss hadn't just tapped her. He had swung the heavy bourbon bottle with the full weight of his shoulder and a lifetime of unchecked entitlement behind it. The sound was like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest, a crack that seemed to split the very atmosphere of Murphy's Tavern wide open. In the heartbeat that followed, the world went terrifyingly still. The jukebox, which had been midway through a gravelly Creedence Clearwater Revival track, seemed to fade into a dull hum. The clinking of glasses and the low murmur of neighborhood gossip vanished, replaced by a vacuum of pure shock. Blood, dark and thick as motor oil in the dim light, began to seep from the jagged gash above Harper Dalton's left ear. It didn't trickle. It poured, a hot, rhythmic pulse that soaked through her hair and stained the collar of her jacket in a matter of seconds. Nobody moved. Pete, the bartender, froze with a glass half-polished in his hand. The college kids at the back of the room looked like wax statues. Even Derek Voss's own friends, men who had spent the last hour posturing and loud-talking, seemed to shrink back, the sudden reality of the violence they had invited finally piercing through their alcoholic haze. They waited for the scream. They waited for her to collapse, to clutch her head and sob, to stumble into the tables like a broken bird. But Harper Dalton didn't scream. She didn't stumble. She didn't even flinch. Slowly, with a terrifying, mechanical deliberateness, she turned her head. She didn't look at the bottle shards on the floor. She didn't look at the blood dripping onto her shoulder. She looked directly at Derek Voss. Her eyes weren't wide with fear or bright with the tears of a victim. They were cold. They were flat. They were the eyes of a person who had seen the worst things the world had to offer and had survived them all. She looked at him as if he hadn't just committed a felony, but had instead made a minor, irritating administrative error, one she was now obligated to correct. It was that stillness that broke him first. Men like Derek Voss, men who live in the shallow end of the pool and mistake their own reflections for depth, don't recognize real danger when it's standing right in front of them. They expect a reaction they can understand. They expect fear because fear is the currency they trade in. When they encounter something that doesn't acknowledge their power, the foundation of their entire world begins to crumble. He had no idea what he had just woken up. He had no idea that the woman bleeding in front of him had been forged in fires he couldn't even imagine. Before we see how this ends, we have to look at how it began. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the perfect time to join us. And do me a favor, drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let's go back to the beginning of a night that was never supposed to end this way. Harper Dalton had a very specific set of rules when it came to bars. She didn't impose these rules on others. She wasn't a preacher or a killjoy. But for herself, the rules were the scaffolding that kept her upright in a civilian world that often felt too soft, too loud, and dangerously unaware. She had learned the hard way, through long, grueling deployments in places that didn't appear on most maps, that certain environments required a heightened state of baseline awareness. Bars were at the top of that list. It wasn't that she was afraid of them. Fear was a luxury she had discarded years ago during her second tour. It was simply that she understood, better than almost anyone else in Coronado, exactly how fast a room full of normal people could descend into chaos. She had seen it happen in 1,000 different ways. She had been in Fallujah when a quiet, dusty street transformed into a kill zone in under 4 seconds. She had been on a fast-roping team in the South China Sea when a routine boarding of a suspicious freighter turned into a bloody standoff that left 2 of her teammates in a German surgical ward for a month. She knew what it felt like when the air changed. She knew the specific, electric shift in the atmosphere that preceded an explosion. It was like the world held its breath, a momentary silence that most people ignored, but that she felt in the marrow of her bones. She felt it the very second those 5 men pushed through the heavy oak doors of Murphy's Tavern. It was a Thursday evening in late October. In Coronado, California, the ocean air at that time of year has a particular bite to it. A salt-heavy chill that reminds you summer is a ghost and winter is whispering at the door. Murphy's was a local institution, the kind of place that had resisted every trend for the last 20 years. It had dark wood paneling that smelled of lemon oil and old beer, a jukebox that leaned heavily toward the kind of music people listen to when they are missing someone, and a bartender named Pete who could tell you the life story of every regular within 3 blocks. Harper wasn't a regular. She had only been to Murphy's 4 times since she'd hung up her uniform 2 years ago. Every single time, it was because of Madison Torres. Madison had been Harper's roommate in college, her emergency contact through every dark night of the soul, and the only person who refused to let Harper disappear into the shadows of her own history. Madison was relentlessly, almost aggressively optimistic. She believed in the power of routine. She believed that a Thursday night beer and a burger were medicine for a soul that had seen too much. "You're doing the thing again," Madison said, her voice cutting through Harper's thoughts. Harper blinked, refocusing on her friend. "What thing?" "The scanning thing, the thing where your eyes move around the room every 45 seconds like you're waiting for a SWAT team to breach the windows. Harper, honey, you're off the clock. You've been off the clock for 730 days. Harper picked up her glass of water. She had already finished her one allowed drink for the night, a single craft ale she'd nursed for 40 minutes. Now she was onto the water. It was an old habit from her training days. Stay hydrated, stay sharp, never let the alcohol dull the senses. "It's just a baseline check, Maddie. Old habits." "Habits are supposed to have expiration dates," Madison countered, leaning back and crossing her arms. She gave Harper that specific look, the one she used when she was trying to decide if she should push harder or let it go. "So, what are you scanning for tonight? Are the retirees at the corner table planning a coup? Is Pete secretly an international arms dealer?" "Nothing specific," Harper said, and at that moment it was true. It was just the hum of the world. She noted the 2 men at the end of the bar who were arguing over a football parlay. She noted the group of Navy technicians near the jukebox who were loud but respectful. She noted the old man by the window, staring out at the street with the weary patience of someone who had run out of things to wait for. "I'm just existing, Madison, I promise." "You're not existing. You're tactical existing," Madison sighed. "You know what your problem is? You're too comfortable being uncomfortable. It's like peace makes you nervous. You're sitting in a quiet bar on a Thursday night in one of the safest towns in America, and you're still looking for the exit routes." Harper didn't have an answer for that because Madison was right. The transition from active service to civilian life hadn't been like a light switch. It was more like trying to learn a new language while everyone around you was shouting in the old one. You didn't just stop being the person who had to survive. You had to convince your body that survival wasn't the only goal anymore. You had to teach your heart to beat at a normal rhythm even when the room was quiet, especially when the room was quiet. "I'm working on it," Harper said softly. "Are you though? Because you haven't dated, you barely go out. You spend your days doing risk assessment for some faceless corporation, and your nights running 10 miles on the beach until your legs give out. What are you waiting for, Harper? The war is over." Harper looked at her oldest friend, the woman who had seen her at her most vulnerable and her most lethal, and she didn't know how to explain that for some people. The war just changes shape. It follows you home, in the way you sit with your back to the wall. It follows you into the grocery store when you find yourself tracking the hands of every person in the aisle. It isn't a choice, it's a renovation of the soul. "I'm just adjusting," Harper said finally. "Some adjustments take longer than others." That was when the door opened. Harper's eyes didn't just move toward the entrance, they locked onto it. It was an instinctive response, a hardwired survival mechanism that kicked in before her conscious mind could even process the movement. 5 men walked in, and the entire temperature of the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. They were in their mid to late 30s, built with the kind of thick, functional muscle that doesn't come from a luxury gym. It was the build of men who spent their lives lifting heavy things or hitting them. They moved with a specific kind of swagger, somewhere between military precision and civilian thuggery, blurred by a long afternoon of drinking. The man in the lead, the one Harper would soon know as Derek Voss, had a gray jacket and a set of shoulders that seemed to demand the world move out of his way. His eyes didn't scan the room for friends or a place to sit. They scanned for dominance. He looked at the tavern the way a wolf looks at a sheepfold, not with interest, but with a sense of innate ownership. Harper had seen his type on every continent she'd ever visited. They were the men who confused aggression for strength and silence for weakness. They were the ones who thrived in environments where they could bully their way to the front of the line because they knew most people would rather look away than stand up. "Who are they?" Madison whispered, her voice losing its playful edge. "Don't know," Harper said. "Don't stare." "I wasn't staring. You were about to. Just look at your drink." The men hit the bar like a wave. They were loud, their laughter jagged and intrusive, cutting through the low-key atmosphere of the tavern. Derek Voss ordered a round of shots and a bottle of bourbon, his voice booming over the jukebox. He turned on his stool, leaning his elbows back against the bar, and began a slow, predatory survey of the room. When his gaze hit Harper and Madison's table, it stopped. Harper didn't look away, but she didn't escalate either. She kept her face a mask of neutral, polite indifference. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to show she wasn't intimidated but short enough to avoid a direct challenge, and then she turned back to Madison. "He's looking at us," Madison said, her knuckles white as she gripped her glass. "I know. Should we leave?" "Not yet," Harper said. "Let's see how the situation develops." "I hate when you say that," Madison hissed. "See how the situation develops. You sound like a tactical briefing. Can't we just say let's go like normal people? If we leave now, we're running. If we're running, he wins. Just breathe, Maddie. He's just a guy who's had too much to drink." But Harper knew he was more than that. She watched him through her peripheral vision. Over the next 20 minutes, she tracked the escalation with the same cold accuracy she had once used to plot sniper nests. The men drank more. Their jokes became meaner, their voices louder. Derek Voss looked over at them 3 more times, and each time the look lasted a little longer. It was a classic display of the itch, the restless, violent energy of a man who was bored and looking for a target to vent his frustrations on. One of his friends, a heavy-set man with a flushed face and a thick beard, leaned over and whispered something to Voss. They both laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Then Derek Voss stood up. He didn't walk toward the bathroom or the jukebox. He walked straight toward their table. "Harper," Madison said, her voice trembling. "He's coming over." "I see him. Stay calm. Let me do the talking." Voss didn't wait for an invitation. He reached out, grabbed the empty third chair at their table, turned it backward, and sat down. He smelled of high-proof whiskey and a stale, aggressive sweat. Up close, his eyes were bloodshot but held a sharp, dangerous clarity. He was the kind of drunk who doesn't lose his coordination, only his inhibitions. "Ladies," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. It was the voice of a man who was used to getting what he wanted from women through a combination of charm and subtle intimidation. "You two look like you're having a pretty summer night. A couple of beauties like you shouldn't be sitting here in the dark all by yourselves." "We're not by ourselves," Harper said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "We're with each other, and we were having a private conversation." Voss's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a decorative gesture, nothing more. He turned his attention to Madison, who was looking down at the table. "You're awfully quiet, sweetheart. What's the matter? You don't like visitors." "We're just having a girls' night," Madison said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'd really appreciate some space." Voss turned back to Harper. He seemed to recognize that she was the one holding the line. "I haven't seen you in here before. You new to Coronado?" "I've been around," Harper said. "Around where? You got that look, like you think you're better than the rest of the room. Like you're judging everyone from your little mountain top." "I'm just drinking my water, Mr. Voss," Harper said, using his name to let him know she'd been paying attention to his group. "And I'm asking you politely to return to your friends." His expression shifted. The charm vanished, replaced by a cold, hard curiosity. "How do you know my name?" "I listen. It's part of the job." "And what job is that?" "Risk assessment," she said. Voss let out a short, barking laugh. "Risk assessment? That's rich. What kind of risks do you assess, sweetheart? Falling off your high heels?" "Various kinds," Harper said. "Most of them involve men who don't know when to walk away." The table went dead quiet. Behind Voss, his friend with the beard had stood up and was drifting toward the table, acting as a silent, looming backup. Pete, the bartender, had stopped working and was watching them closely, his hand hovering near the phone under the counter. "You got a smart mouth," Voss said, leaning forward until he was inches from Harper's face. "I don't like smart mouths on women. I like them to be grateful. My friends and I, we just got back from some real work overseas. We're veterans. We deserve a little hospitality." Harper didn't blink. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Voss, I mean that. Now, for the last time, please leave us alone." Voss's eyes narrowed. He looked her up and down, making a deliberate show of dismissing her. He saw a woman who was lean, yes, but small compared to him. He saw someone who didn't raise her voice, who didn't show fear, and he misinterpreted that as a bluff. He was a man who lived by the rules of the playground. Whoever was loudest and biggest was the boss. He had no concept of the kind of power that doesn't need to shout. "Or what?" he whispered. "What are you going to do?" His friend reached the table and put a heavy hand on the back of Madison's chair, leaning over her. Madison went rigid, her breath coming in shallow hitches. "Get your hand off her chair," Harper said. Her voice hadn't gotten louder, but it had changed. It had gone from polite to something else, something that sounded like a warning klaxon in a submarine. "Make me," the friend sneered. "Hey, guys," Pete called out from behind the bar. "Take it outside, don't make me call the cops." Voss didn't even look at Pete. He was locked on Harper. He felt the challenge now, and his pride, the brittle, dangerous pride of a man who feels the world is passing him by, wouldn't let him back down. He reached back toward the bar counter where someone had left a full, unopened bottle of bourbon. "You know what your problem is?" Voss said, his face twisting into a sneer. "You've never been put in your place. You think because you're pretty you can talk to men like me however you want." Harper saw it coming. She saw the way his muscles tensed, the way his weight shifted to his front foot. She could have moved. She could have ducked or struck him before he even cleared the chair. But part of her, the part that had been trying to be civilian for 2 years, wanted to give him every possible chance to stop. She wanted to be wrong about him. She wasn't. Voss stood up, his hand closing around the neck of the bottle. "Sweetheart," he said, "let me give you your first lesson in risk assessment." He swung. The bottle connected with the back of Harper's head with a sickening, dull thud. It didn't shatter. It was too heavy for that, but it did its job. The impact sent a shockwave through her skull that would have knocked a normal person unconscious instantly. Blood sprayed across the table, splashing onto Madison's arm. Madison screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror. Voss stood there, a triumphant, ugly grin on his face. He started to turn back to his friends, expecting to see Harper slumped over the table or sliding onto the floor in a heap of broken dignity. But Harper Dalton was still standing. She didn't fall, she didn't even sway. Her hand came up almost slowly and her fingers touched the jagged line above her ear. She brought her hand back and looked at the bright, arterial red coating her fingertips. She looked at the blood with a strange, clinical detachment, as if she were inspecting a piece of faulty equipment. Then she looked back at Derek Voss. The grin on his face didn't just fade, it evaporated. It was replaced by a look of profound, primal confusion. He was staring at a woman who had just taken a blow that should have ended the fight, and she was looking back at him like she was just getting started. The administrative error she had seen earlier had now been upgraded to a critical failure. "Okay," Harper said. Her voice was so quiet it was barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent bar. "Now we can do this." Voss tried to swing again, but the window of opportunity for his brand of violence had closed. Harper moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics in that dim, beer-scented room. She didn't move away from the blow, she moved into it. She stepped inside the arc of his arm, her body a blur of practiced, lethal efficiency. She caught his wrist with her left hand, and before he could even register the touch, she applied a rotational lock that sent a bolt of agony up his arm. At the same time, her right hand delivered a palm strike to his solar plexus. The air left Voss's lungs in a pathetic, wheezing gasp. His knees buckled, and he hit the floor with a heavy thud, the bourbon bottle rolling harmlessly away across the sawdust. The big man with the beard, the one who had been leaning on Madison's chair, didn't have time to process what had happened to his leader. He lunged at Harper, his arms wide, trying to use his sheer mass to crush her against the table. Harper didn't even look at him. She felt his momentum, his weight, and his lack of balance. As he reached for her, she pivoted on her heel, grabbed his outstretched arm, and used his own forward motion to propel him over her hip. He didn't just fall, he flew. He slammed into the neighboring table, splintering the wood and landing in a heap of broken glass and spilled beer. The bar erupted. People were screaming, scrambling to get out of the way. Pete was on the phone, his voice a frantic staccato as he called for the police. Two more of Voss's friends, the younger ones who had stayed at the bar, saw their companions on the floor and charged. They weren't thinkers, they were pack animals. They didn't see a woman, they saw an obstacle that needed to be trampled. Harper moved through them like a ghost. This was what 12 years of the elite service had bought her. This was what the 1,000-yard stare was built on. She didn't see them as people. She saw them as a series of anatomical vulnerabilities. A throat, a knee, an eye, a nerve cluster. She struck with a precision that was almost beautiful in its brutality. The first man went down with a crushed windpipe, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The second took a heel to the kneecap that ended his night, and likely his walking career, in a single, sickening pop. It had been less than 30 seconds since the bottle had hit her head. The fifth man, the youngest of the group, stood by the jukebox. He looked at his four friends, men he had considered untouchable, groaning and bleeding on the floor. He looked at Harper, who was standing in the center of the room, blood still pouring down the side of her face, her eyes as calm as a frozen lake. He raised his hands. "I'm done," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm out. I didn't do anything." "Sit down," Harper said. "On the floor, hands where I can see them." The kid dropped to his knees as if he'd been shot. He didn't move a muscle, but the night wasn't over. Derek Voss, fueled by a mixture of shock, pain, and a level of humiliation he couldn't survive, was clawing his way back up. He used the edge of the bar to pull himself to his feet. His face was a mask of rage, his teeth bared in a snarl. "You think you're something." He spat, his voice thick with blood. "You think you're tough? You're a dead woman." His hand went to his belt. It was a quick, practiced motion. A sheath clicked open, and a 6-inch tactical blade caught the light of the neon beer signs. He held it in a low, professional grip, the grip of someone who knew how to use a knife to take a life. The room went cold again. A bottle was one thing, a knife was an intent to kill. "Put it down, Derek," Harper said. Her voice was steady, almost weary. "You've already lost. Don't make this something you can't come back from." "I'm going to carve that look right off your face," Voss said. He started to circle her, his feet moving in the rhythmic shuffle of a street fighter. Harper watched him. She didn't watch the knife, she watched his eyes. The eyes tell you everything. They tell you when the lungs are about to expand for the charge. They tell you when the weight is shifting. They tell you where the soul is aiming. "I'm going to give you one chance," Harper said, her voice dropping to a level that made the hair on the back of Pete, the bartender's neck, stand up. "Drop the knife, sit on the floor, and wait for the police. If you take one more step toward me, I will stop being polite." Voss didn't listen. He couldn't. His entire identity was wrapped up in the idea that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. If he accepted that he wasn't, he would have to face the fact that he was nothing more than a bully in a gray jacket. He lunged. It was a good move, a fast, low thrust aimed at her midsection. Against anyone else, it would have been a killing blow. But Harper Dalton wasn't anyone else. She moved with a fluidity that looked like dancing. She parried the knife hand with her forearm, her skin grazing the cold steel, and in the same heartbeat she stepped behind him. It was a move called a rear naked choke. But when Harper did it, it wasn't a sports maneuver. It was a mechanical shutdown of the human system. Her right arm wrapped around his throat, the crook of her elbow aligning perfectly with his windpipe. Her left hand locked onto her own bicep, creating a vice that no amount of struggling could break. She settled her weight, pulling him off balance, and leaned into the pressure. Voss thrashed. He tried to stab backward, but his arm was trapped. He tried to buck his hips, but she was like a shadow anchored to him. His face went from red to a deep, bruised purple. His eyes bulged, the knife slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. 11 seconds, Harper whispered into his ear. "That's how long it takes for the lights to go out. Just breathe, Derek, it's almost over." At 9 seconds, his body went limp. At 11, she released him, and he slumped to the floor like a sack of grain. Harper stood over him for a moment, her chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. She reached up and wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. The adrenaline was still there, a hot, buzzing current under her skin, but she held it down, she locked it back in the cage where it lived. She turned to Madison. Madison was still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide, her hands shaking. She looked at Harper, really looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years of friendship, she realized she didn't know the woman standing in front of her at all. She knew the girl who liked old movies and running on the beach. She didn't know the predator who had just dismantled 5 grown men without breaking a sweat. "Are you okay?" Harper asked. Madison couldn't speak. She just nodded, a small, jerky movement of her head. Harper looked around the bar. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the distant, approaching wail of police sirens. She walked over to the bar, picked up a clean napkin, and pressed it to the wound on her head. "Pete," she said, looking at the bartender. "Yeah, Harper." Pete's voice was hushed, respectful. "I'm sorry about the furniture. Put it on my tab." She walked back to the table, picked up her jacket, and draped it over her blood-stained shoulder. She didn't look at the men on the floor. She didn't look at the crowd of onlookers who were now filming the aftermath on their phones. She just looked at the door. The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights beginning to flash against the windows of Murphy's Tavern. The civilian world was coming back, with its forms and its questions and its rules. The war was over, at least for tonight. As the first officers pushed through the door, their guns drawn and their voices barking orders, Harper Dalton simply stood there. She didn't look like a hero, and she didn't look like a victim. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been pushed, and who had finally, after 2 long years of trying to be quiet, decided to push back. The police would spend hours taking statements. They would watch the security footage in stunned silence, rewinding the part where the bottle hit her head and she didn't fall. They would find the tactical knife on the floor and the bruised throats of the men who thought they were kings. They would ask her where she learned to move like that, and she would give them the same answer she gave everyone. "I've been around." But as she sat in the back of the ambulance later that night, getting her scalp stitched by a young paramedic who couldn't stop staring at her, Harper looked out at the dark Pacific Ocean. She felt the cold air on her face, and for the first time since she'd left the service, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to happen. She realized that Madison was wrong. You don't adjust to the world by trying to forget who you are. You adjust by realizing that the person you were trained to be is still there, and that sometimes in the dark corners of a quiet town, that person is exactly what the world needs. The risk assessment was finished. The threat had been neutralized, and as the sun began to peek over the horizon of Coronado, Harper Dalton finally allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe. The tavern would eventually be repaired. The blood would be scrubbed from the floor, and the broken tables would be replaced with new ones. Pete would tell the story of the woman in gray for the next 20 years, turning it into a local legend that grew with every telling. But Harper wouldn't be there to hear it. She had other places to be, other rules to follow, and a new understanding of the silence. She knew now that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the ability to handle it when it finally, inevitably, found you. And as she walked home along the beach, her footsteps leaving steady marks in the wet sand, she didn't look back once. She just kept moving forward, toward the light, toward the next day, a warrior in a world that was finally starting to make sense again. The transition from vertical to horizontal had been a quick, brutal descent for Marcus, and though he was not unconscious, he was effectively finished. Harper had not taken him fully under into the dark of a blackout, but she had dismantled his will to fight with a series of surgical strikes that left his nervous system screaming for a ceasefire. His body had made the ultimate executive decision that it was done for the evening, resigning itself to the cold, sticky floor of Murphy's Tavern. The bar, which moments ago had been a chaotic theater of shouting and breaking glass, fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Harper stepped back from the wreckage, her lungs working hard to pull in the air that was thick with the scent of spilled beer, stale popcorn, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. She was breathing harder now, the adrenaline beginning its slow, shaky retreat from her extremities. The blood from her scalp, a warm and persistent ribbon of red, ran freely down the side of her face, staining the collar of her shirt and dripping onto the floor. Her jacket was ruined, torn at the shoulder where Marcus had tried to anchor himself to her on his way down to the boards. She stood in the center of the room, a small figure amidst the carnage, and looked around at the 5 men who had thought they could corner her. They were in various states of incapacitation, groaning or gasping, their bravado replaced by the stunned realization of their own fragility. Madison was still pinned against the far wall, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth as if to keep a scream from escaping. But her eyes were different now. The raw terror had evaporated, replaced by a haunting look of disbelief. It was a look Harper had seen before on the faces of people who had just witnessed something that defied their understanding of the natural world. Something fast, lethal, and impossibly efficient. Pete, the bartender whose hands usually moved with the practiced rhythm of a man pouring drafts, lowered the phone from his ear with a trembling hand. His face was pale beneath the dim amber lights of the bar. "I've got 911 on the line," he said, his voice forced into a level of calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They're on their way. They've got units nearby." "Good," Harper said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Her hand went to her scalp again, feeling the split in the skin. The bleeding was starting to slow, thickening as it clotted. Scalp wounds were notorious for their theatricality. They bled like a fountain, but usually weren't as serious as they looked to the uninitiated. She had endured worse. In the dark corners of the world where she had spent the better part of a decade, she had suffered injuries that made this laceration look like a paper cut. She had lived through things that would haunt most people's nightmares, and she had done it with the same cold, professional detachment she felt right now. "I'm fine," she said, more to herself than to Pete. Madison finally found her voice, though it was little more than a strained whisper. "Harper." Harper turned her head slowly to look at her friend. The movement sent a fresh throb of pain through her temple, but she didn't flinch. "I'm never asking you to go to a bar with me again," Madison said, her voice cracking slightly with a mix of relief and lingering shock. And somewhere in the deep, quiet place underneath the fading adrenaline, underneath the years of brutal training and the cold, professional calm that had carried her through the last 4 minutes of violence, Harper Dalton felt something stir. It was almost, not quite, but almost, like a laugh. It was the irony of the civilian world crashing into the reality of what she was. She didn't laugh, though. Instead, she walked to the nearest table and sat down heavily. She took a clean bar napkin, folded it with steady fingers, and pressed it firmly against the side of her head. She sat there, a silent sentinel, and waited for the police to arrive and pick up the pieces of the night. On the floor of Murphy's Tavern, the 5 men began the slow, agonizing process of understanding what had happened to them. They were in Coronado, California, a town that felt safe and predictable, yet they had just been dismantled by a woman half their size. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, echoing off the storefronts of the quiet street. Behind the bar, Pete reached under the counter and checked the security camera monitor. What he saw on that screen, 4 minutes and 37 seconds of footage, made him exhale slowly through his teeth. He shook his head in a way that suggested he already knew, even before the first officer stepped through the door, that this story was not going to stay within the wood-paneled walls of Murphy's. This was going to go everywhere. The first police unit arrived at 9:47 p.m., its blue and red lights painting the interior of the bar in rhythmic flashes. Officer Reyes was the first to push through the heavy wooden door, his hand already resting on the holster of his sidearm. The dispatch call had been ominous. Multiple victims, a possible ongoing altercation, and sounds of significant violence. In Reyes's 11 years on the force, that usually meant a chaotic mess of screaming people, flying chairs, or something that required immediate, overwhelming force to contain. What he found instead was a scene of eerie stillness. There was no ongoing altercation. There were 5 grown men scattered across the floor, looking like they had been hit by a localized hurricane. One woman sat calmly at a table near the center of the room, a blood-soaked napkin held to her head, watching him with an unnerving, steady gaze. The rest of the patrons were like statues, their eyes locked on the woman with an expression of profound, unfiled shock. Reyes stopped just inside the door, his boots crunching on a fragment of glass. He took 3 full seconds to process the scene, his eyes darting from the man groaning by the pool table to the one slumped against the bar. Finally, his gaze settled on Pete. "She do this?" Reyes asked, his voice thick with skepticism. Pete nodded once, a quick, jerky motion. "Every single one of them," he said. Reyes looked back at Harper. She looked back at him, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed despite the blood matting her hair. The napkin was now soaked through on one side, a deep, dark crimson. "Ma'am," Reyes said, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "Are you injured?" "Scalp laceration," she said, her voice clear and devoid of tremor. "Superficial. I've had worse." There was something about the way she said it, not with the bravado of a street fighter or the hysteria of a victim, but with the flat, clinical accuracy of a surgeon. She stated it as a simple fact of her reality, the same way one might mention the weather or the temperature of their coffee. It made Reyes pause for half a beat. He had interviewed countless soldiers, decorated veterans, and seasoned first responders over the years. He knew what that particular brand of combat-tested calm looked like. He just hadn't expected to find it sitting in a neighborhood bar on a Thursday night in the middle of a civilian life. "I'm going to need you to stay seated," he said, though it was clear she had no intention of moving. "I wasn't planning on going anywhere," Harper replied. His partner, Officer Chen, was already moving through the room with the efficiency of a trained observer. She crouched beside each of the men on the floor, checking pulses, assessing responsiveness, and calling in her findings over the radio. Derek Voss was conscious but drifting in a fog of pain, sitting slumped against the base of the bar and cradling a shattered wrist against his chest. Marcus, the large, bearded man who had been the primary aggressor, was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling with an expression of profound, existential confusion. He was breathing, his chest rising and falling in ragged hitches, but he seemed unable to form words or even acknowledge the officer's presence. The other 3 were in various states of distress between those 2 extremes, nursing broken noses, cracked ribs, and the crushing weight of their bruised egos. "What happened to him?" Chen called out from across the room, indicating Marcus. "He fell on his back," Harper said, her tone matter of fact. Hard, he should be assessed for a concussion. His pupils were dilated when he went down. Chen looked at her partner. Reyes looked back. A silent communication, born of 11 years on the same shift, passed between them. It was the look of two people who realized they were standing in the middle of a very complicated situation. By now, Madison had finally moved away from the wall. She stepped toward Harper's table, her hand reaching out to rest on Harper's shoulder. It was the touch of someone who needed to confirm that the person in front of them was real, that she was still present and not about to collapse from the wound on her head. "She needs medical attention," Madison said to Reyes, her voice regaining some of its strength. "That cut on her head is deep. I saw it happen." "I'm aware," Reyes said, his tone softening slightly. "EMS is 2 minutes out." He pulled out his notebook and a pen, the familiar tools of his trade. "Can you tell me exactly what happened here tonight?" Harper told him. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't leave anything out, and she didn't offer any emotional commentary. She spoke chronologically, starting with the moment the 5 men entered the bar. She described how Derek Voss had approached their table, the specific nature of his harassment, and the escalation of the threat. She detailed the verbal warnings she had given him, warnings that had been ignored. She described the bottle hitting her head and the immediate, instinctive response that followed. As she spoke, describing the mechanics of the fight, the strikes, the leverage, the economy of motion, Reyes wrote it all down. He kept his eyes on his notebook, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but inside his mind was racing. When she finished her account, he looked up, his pen hovering over the paper. "Ma'am, what is your background professionally?" "I was in the Navy," she said. "I separated 2 years ago." "What was your role?" There was a brief beat of silence. It wasn't hesitation, but rather the pause of someone weighing exactly how much context was necessary for the record. "Special operations," she said. Reyes looked down at his notebook, then at the 5 men being tended to by his partner, then back at the small woman sitting at the table. "Navy SEAL?" he asked, the words feeling heavy in the quiet bar. "Yes," she said. He wrote that down, his hand moving slower now. Then he looked up at Pete behind the bar. "You have security footage running the whole time?" Pete nodded, already reaching for the DVR system. "I'll pull it for you right now. You're going to want to see this." The 2nd police unit arrived 2 minutes later, followed by an EMS team 90 seconds after that. Murphy's Tavern, usually a place of quiet neighborhood drinks and low-key conversation, had been transformed into a hive of professional activity. 8 additional people were now in the room, each performing a specific, focused role. The civilians who had witnessed the event were gathered near the front, waiting to give their statements. Most of them had their phones out, their thumbs flying across screens as they shared what they had seen with the world outside. Their eyes kept darting back to Harper, their expressions a mix of awe and a strange, newfound fear. The paramedic who approached Harper was a young man named Torres. He had the calm, detached composure of someone who was still new enough to the job to find every shift an adventure. He cleaned the laceration on Harper's scalp with practiced hands, his brow furrowing as he inspected the depth of the wound. "You're going to need stitches," he told her. "Probably 6 to 8. We should get you to the hospital to make sure there's no internal swelling or a fracture." "Can I give my statement first?" Harper asked, her eyes steady. Torres looked at her for a moment, then at the carnage in the room and made the same internal recalibration everyone else had made that night. He realized he wasn't dealing with a typical victim. "I'll get the materials to close it temporarily with a pressure bandage," he said. "But we're going to the hospital immediately after. That's non-negotiable." "Thank you," she said. As Torres worked on her head, Detective Anita Marsh arrived. Marsh was a 15-year veteran of the Coronado PD, a woman who had transferred from San Diego homicide 3 years prior to find a quieter life. She had seen the absolute worst of what human beings could do to one another, and very little in this world surprised her anymore. She walked into the bar, took a slow, sweeping look at the room, and spoke quietly with Officer Reyes for nearly a minute. Then she walked over to Harper's table and pulled out a chair. "Detective Marsh," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm and dry. "Harper Dalton," Harper replied, returning the handshake. Marsh didn't use the standard department-issued notebook. She had a yellow legal pad and a pen that looked like it had seen a lot of use. She looked at Harper with a direct, unhurried gaze, the kind of look used by people who had long ago stopped pretending to be attentive and simply were. "Walk me through it," Marsh said. "Start from the beginning." Harper walked her through it again, her voice never wavering. Marsh listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across the yellow paper. When Harper reached the end, Marsh tapped the end of her pen against the pad twice, a rhythmic, thoughtful sound. You gave them multiple verbal warnings, Marsh noted. Yes. This was before the bottle was used as a weapon. Yes. And you believe the witnesses will confirm that? You can ask anyone who was here, Harper said, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the bar. Marsh looked over at the crowd of civilians. One woman, a local in her 50s who had been sitting 2 tables away, met the detective's eyes and gave a firm, resolute nod. It was the look of someone who wanted to ensure justice was served for what she had witnessed. We'll get their statements, Marsh said, turning back to Harper. Do you have legal representation? Not currently. I'd recommend getting some, Marsh said, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. Not because I think you're in trouble. Based on what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, this looks like a textbook case of self-defense. Your account matches the initial statements from the room, but this is going to get complicated, Harper. She paused, looking at the men being loaded onto gurneys. 5 men, 1 woman, and a clear set of security footage. This is going to go public, and it's going to happen fast. You need someone in your corner who understands how to handle the fallout. Harper looked at her steadily. I understand. Do you have someone you can call tonight? I'll figure it out, Harper said. Marsh held her gaze for another long moment. Navy SEAL, she said softly. It wasn't a question this time, but a statement of recognition. Yes. What team? Harper told her. Marsh wrote it down without changing her expression, but Harper noticed a slight shift in the detective's posture, a micro-adjustment of professional respect that most would have missed. Harper didn't miss it. All right, Marsh said, standing up and tucking her legal pad under her arm. We're going to need you available for a follow-up. Don't leave the area without letting us know. I'll be at the hospital, Harper said. After that, I'll be at my apartment. Good. Marsh moved away to oversee the final processing of the scene, and Madison appeared at Harper's side again, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Pete had apparently decided that the remaining people in his bar needed caffeine, a practical human gesture that reminded Harper why she liked the man. Here, Madison said, handing a cup to Harper. Thank you. Madison sat down, wrapping both of her hands around her own cup as if seeking warmth. Around them, the room was still a blur of motion. Paramedics wheeling out gurneys, officers taking photos of the floor, the low murmur of professional voices. But in their small corner of the tavern, the world had gone temporarily still. I need to ask you something, Madison said, her eyes fixed on her coffee. Okay, and I need you to answer me honestly. I always answer you honestly, Harper said. Are you okay? The question was simple, yet it carried a weight that filled the space between them. Harper knew what Madison was really asking. She wasn't asking about the 8 stitches she was about to get, or the adrenaline dump, or the legal ramifications. She was asking about the thing that lived underneath the surface, the part of Harper that had gone cold and operational the moment that bottle shattered. She was asking if Harper was okay with the fact that after 2 years of civilian life, the machinery of war was still perfectly calibrated and ready to engage at a moment's notice. I'm okay, Harper said. That's not what I know what you're asking, Madison. Harper looked down at the dark swirl of her coffee, and the answer is still yes. I'm okay. It didn't feel good. It never feels good to have to do that. But I'm okay with who I am and what I had to do. Madison studied her face for a long time, searching for a crack in the armor. They would have hurt us, she finally said, her voice a whisper. Yes, they were going to hurt us, Harper agreed. Then you did what you had to do. Yes. And as Harper said the word, she realized the complexity of the situation. It wasn't about whether she had done the right thing, she knew she had. It was about what the night had revealed. 2 years of quiet living, of coffee shops and morning runs and civilian jobs, hadn't slowed the clockwork of her training. The speed and precision with which she had dismantled 5 men was a testament to a life she thought she had left behind. She didn't know yet if she should be grateful for that lingering edge or deeply troubled by it. It was during this quiet moment, as the 2 women sat with their coffee, that the first ripples of the digital storm began to appear. One of the college students near the jukebox had been recording the entire encounter on his phone. He hadn't planned to post it. He had pulled out his phone as a reflexive modern habit when things started looking dangerous. But after watching the footage in the safety of the bathroom, he had been struck by the sheer, cinematic intensity of what he'd captured. He had uploaded the video to 3 different platforms with a short, breathless caption. Asterisk, this just happened at Murphy's in Coronado. She is not the one to mess with. Asterisk, he didn't know she was a SEAL. No one in the bar besides the authorities knew that yet, but the internet didn't need a resume to recognize a viral moment. By the time Harper was being helped into the EMS vehicle outside, the video had already racked up 40,000 views. By the time she was sitting in a sterile room at Coronado Hospital, it had climbed to 300,000. As the nurse was handing Harper her discharge paperwork and instructions for caring for the 8 stitches now neatly lining her scalp, Harper's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Detective Marsh. "Dalton, it's Marsh. I need you to be aware of something." The detective's voice was still professional, but there was a new tension underneath it, the sound of someone trying to stay ahead of a situation that was moving faster than the law allowed. "There's footage of the incident circulating online," Marsh said. "A significant number of people have already seen it." "How significant?" Harper asked. "As of 10 minutes ago, over 500,000 views, and someone has identified you." Harper felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "Not just your name," Marsh continued. "Your service record is out there. Someone posted your full SEAL designation, your deployment history, and your commendations. It's all over the comments." Harper looked at the white-tiled wall of the emergency room. "Where did they get that? We're looking into it. Some of it is technically public record if you know where to dig, but—" Marsh paused, and Harper could almost hear her choosing her words. "Some of it should definitely not be public. It's too detailed and it appeared too fast. Who identified me? That's the question of the hour," Marsh said. "It came from an account that was deleted almost immediately after the information was posted. The post went up within 40 minutes of the incident. That's not a random bystander recognizing you from a grainy video, Harper. That's someone who was already looking for you, or someone who was watching for exactly this kind of event," Harper added, her mind already shifting back into a tactical mindset. Marsh let that hang in the air for a moment. "Miss Dalton, is there anything about tonight that you haven't told me yet?" Harper thought about Derek Voss. She remembered the specific way he had looked at her when she used the term risk assessment. It hadn't been the look of a drunk bully. It had been the look of a man who had been given a target and suddenly realized the target was armed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's not a no." "No," Harper agreed, "it's not." "Call me the second you think of something," Marsh said, "and Harper, get that legal representation tonight. I mean it." The call ended, leaving the room feeling smaller and colder than before. Madison, who had been watching Harper's face throughout the conversation, didn't wait for her to speak. "What is it?" she asked. "The video is everywhere," Harper said, her voice low. "Someone leaked my service record, everything. They did it within 40 minutes of the fight." Madison's eyes widened. 40 minutes, that's impossible for a stranger." "Exactly," Harper said, "so this wasn't just a random bar fight." Madison's voice dropped a register, trembling slightly. "Derek Voss didn't just pick us out of a crowd." "I don't know that for sure," Harper said, "but the timing suggests that tonight was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else." The emergency room continued its steady, necessary hum around them. Somewhere across the country, and even across oceans, the video was being shared and reshared. The comments were already a battlefield of opinions. Some were in awe of her skills, others were outraged on behalf of the men, and a growing number were asking pointed questions about who Harper Dalton really was. And in a room Harper couldn't yet imagine, a man who was not Derek Voss watched the footage on a high-definition monitor. He watched the way Harper moved, the way she used her environment, the way she didn't waste a single heartbeat. When the video looped back to the beginning, he closed his laptop and sat in the darkness. His face wasn't surprised. It was the face of a man who was making a calculation, adjusting a plan that had already been set in motion. Back at the hospital, Harper signed her discharge papers and stood up. She felt steady, her body recovered from the initial shock of the violence. She looked at Madison. "I need to make some calls," she said. "To who?" "My grandfather first," Harper said, "and then to some people I used to work with." Madison studied her, seeing the change in her eyes. "You're building a team already." "I'm asking questions," Harper corrected. "The team comes after I have the answers." She walked toward the hospital exit, her ruined jacket draped over her arm, the white bandage on her head a stark contrast against her dark hair. As she approached the automatic doors, they slid open, and the night air rushed in, cold, sharp, and smelling of the Pacific salt. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She stopped and answered it. She said nothing, waiting for the other side to speak. 2 seconds of silence passed. Then a voice she didn't recognize, low, controlled, and carrying the cadence of a man reading from a prepared script, spoke. "You should have stayed home tonight, Harper." The line went dead. She stood in the doorway, the phone still pressed to her ear, the cold wind whipping around her. The part of her that had spent 12 years reading the shape of danger recognized the threat immediately. This wasn't the clumsy aggression of 5 men in a bar. This was something larger, colder, and far more organized. She lowered the phone and looked out at the street. It was an ordinary, quiet Coronado street at 11 p.m., lined with parked cars and glowing streetlights. It looked perfectly safe. It looked like a place where nothing bad could ever happen. Harper put her phone in her pocket, pulled on her jacket, and started walking. She didn't go toward her apartment. She headed toward her grandfather's house. He would have answers, or he would know exactly where to find them. Behind her, Madison called her name. Harper turned back for a moment. "Don't go alone," Madison pleaded, standing in the fluorescent light of the hospital entrance. Harper looked at her oldest friend for a long moment. She thought about the voice on the phone. She thought about the precision of the leak. "I won't," she said, and she meant it. The night was clear and full of information she didn't yet possess. Harper moved through the shadows with the same deliberate care she had used in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. Everything she had been trained to be was now running just below the surface, a silent engine of survival. Her grandfather, Walter Dalton, was 71 years old. He had been a Navy SEAL before Harper was even born, back in the era when the teams were small. Their missions were ghosts, and no one wrote books about what they did. He had retired as a Master Chief and moved to Coronado because he said the ocean kept a man honest. He spent his days woodworking in his garage and his evenings drinking black coffee and watching the news with the skeptical eye of a man who knew what was happening behind the headlines. He was still awake when Harper knocked on his door at 11:23 p.m. He opened it, took one look at the bandage, the torn jacket, and the look in her eyes, and stepped back to let her in without a word. Walter reads situations the way a tracker read a trail, fast, accurately, and without needing a preamble. She sat at his kitchen table, the air smelling of cedar shavings and strong coffee. He placed a mug in front of her and sat across from her, his large, calloused hands resting on the table. "Someone sent those men to the bar tonight," she said. Walter was quiet for a beat, his eyes searching hers. "You sure?" "No, but I'm sure enough." She told him everything. The fight, the risk assessment look from Voss, the viral video, the detailed leak of her record, and the phone call. As she spoke, Walter's expression didn't change, but his focus intensified. He became a man who was no longer retired, but once again a leader of men in a world of shadows. "You should have stayed home tonight," Walter repeated quietly, his voice a low gravel. "You recognize that phrase?" she asked. "I might," he said. He stood up, his joints popping with the familiar protests of age, and went to the cabinet above the refrigerator. He returned with a thick manila folder, worn at the edges and stuffed with papers. He set it on the table between them. She looked at the folder, then at him. "How long have you had this?" "3 weeks, Walter said. "Walter, what is this? Why didn't you tell me?" "I was trying to confirm it before I brought you into it," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't want to bring that world back to your doorstep if I didn't have to." He opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, grainy surveillance photographs, and pages of handwritten notes on yellow legal paper in his tight, precise script. Harper leaned in, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. "This isn't about a bar fight," Walter said, pointing to a photograph of a man she didn't recognize. "And it's not just about you. It's about why they want you back in the game." Harper looked at the first document. It was a redacted mission report from 6 years ago, a mission she had led, one she had been told was classified at the highest level. Her eyes scanned the text, finding her own name and the names of her team. "They're looking for the asset," Walter whispered, "and they think you're the only one who knows where it is." Harper felt the room tilt. The civilian world she had tried so hard to build was vanishing, replaced by the familiar, high-stakes geography of a covert operation. She looked at the manila folder, then at her grandfather. "Who is they?" she asked. Walter met her gaze, his eyes hard as flint. "The people who are tired of you being retired, Harper, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Outside, a car drove slowly past the house, its headlights cutting across the kitchen walls. Harper didn't move, but her mind was already 2 steps ahead, calculating the distance to the back exit, the location of her grandfather's safe, and the first move in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. The night was no longer quiet. It was full of voices from her past, and they were all calling her name. The kitchen was bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of the overhead light, a stark contrast to the deep, rhythmic shadows of the California night pressing against the windows. On the worn wooden table lay a manila folder, its edges frayed, containing the blueprints of a shadow. Harper stared at the handwriting, sharp and disciplined, a soldier's script. Beside the notes were photographs of men whose faces were masks of professional indifference, men she didn't recognize, yet whose posture and eyes she knew intimately. They were the kind of men who blended into the background of a high-end hotel lobby or a dusty border crossing with equal ease. Then there were the manifests, shipping documents, logistics codes, and technical specifications for military hardware that should never have been in private hands. "There is a network," Walter said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate through the table. He explained that they were operating primarily out of the western United States, but their reach was stretching, spider-webbing into the volatile markets of Mexico and the deep, unregulated pockets of Eastern Europe. They weren't just stealing, they were harvesting. They were acquiring decommissioned U.S. military equipment, advanced weaponry, encrypted communications hardware, tactical vehicles, through compromised logistics channels deep inside the Department of Defense. They had been operating in the white noise of the bureaucracy for approximately 18 months, moving like ghosts through the very system designed to track them. Walter's finger, calloused and steady, tapped a photograph in the center of the spread. "The man who runs it used to lead a SEAL support unit out of Coronado," he said. "His name is Raymond Colt. He was discharged 14 months ago under circumstances the Navy has not made public." Harper picked up the photo. Colt was in his mid-50s, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of granite and eyes that had long ago discarded the notion of external authority. He was a man who had decided that the rules of engagement were suggestions and that the law was a hurdle for lesser men. Harper had never crossed paths with him during her time in the service, but she had met his breed before. They were the ones who stayed in the shadows too long until the shadows became all they knew. "What does this have to do with Derek Voss?" Harper asked, her voice tight. The memory of the bar fight, the scent of spilled beer, the wet crunch of bone, the cold adrenaline was still fresh, a dull throb behind her eyes. Walter leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Derek Voss has been working security contracting for Colt's network for the past 8 months. He's not at the top. He's not even close to the inner circle, but he's connected enough to be useful. They sent him to that bar, or more likely, he was already watching you." Harper looked up, her brow furrowing. "Watching me? Why?" "Because you were flagged," Walter said simply. The word hung in the air, heavy and clinical. "Flagged how?" she asked. She thought of her life since leaving the Navy, the quiet consulting work, the risk assessment contracts that kept her sharp but kept her distanced from the front lines. "3 months ago, you did a security audit for a logistics firm in San Diego," Walter reminded her. "What did you find?" Harper closed her eyes, reaching back into her memory. The audit had felt routine, almost boring. She had spent days in a windowless office, scrolling through digital manifests and cross-referencing shipping weights with fuel expenditures. She remembered filing the report, noting a series of anomalies in their outbound documentation. Nothing that screamed international arms smuggling at the time, but enough to warrant a formal internal review. She had recommended it, the firm had thanked her, paid her invoice, and she had moved on to the next contract. Irregularities in their outbound manifest records, she said slowly, the pieces beginning to click into place with a sickening mechanical precision. Equipment classifications that didn't match the actual cargo descriptions. Discrepancies in the seal numbers on the containers. That firm, Walter said, is a front company for Colt's network. The kitchen went deathly quiet. The only sound was the distant, indifferent roar of the Pacific Ocean 2 blocks away, a constant reminder of the world's vastness and her own small place within it. The realization settled over her like a cold shroud. The encounter at the bar hadn't been a random act of barum machismo. It hadn't been about her being a woman in the wrong place. "They know I saw their records," Harper said, her voice a flat monotone. "They know you saw them, and they know you're the kind of person who remembers what she sees," Walter confirmed. She sat with that for a moment, the weight of the implications pressing down on her. "The bar wasn't random," she repeated, more to herself than to him. "They weren't trying to kill me. If they wanted me dead, they would have used a long gun from a block away or a suppressed pistol in the parking lot. They were trying to assess me. To see how you'd respond," Walter added. "To see if you'd gone to the authorities about what you found, or if you were just another consultant looking for a paycheck. They wanted to know if you were a threat and whether you could be intimidated into silence." He paused, his eyes searching hers. They got their answer on all three. Harper felt a grim smile touch her lips, though there was no humor in it. Yes, they did. And now they know exactly who they're dealing with, which means the calculus on their end has changed. Walter closed the folder with a definitive snap. They will escalate. Tonight bought you maybe 48 hours before they decide what the next move is. They'll need to scrub the trail, and you're the biggest loose end they have. He looked at her steadily across the table, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes. Who else knows about this on our side right now? Just you and me, Harper said. And I think you know who we need to call, Walter said. She did know. She had known the moment the doctor started stitching her scalp in the ER. She had known it during the cold walk through the night air, and she had been running the names through her head ever since. A list of people who had been forged in the same fire she had, people who spoke the same silent language of tactical necessity. They have lives now, Walter, she said, a final, flickering hesitation in her voice. Careers, families, a piece they earned. So did you, Walter replied, until tonight. Harper picked up her phone. The digital clock on the screen read 11:41 p.m. The world was asleep, but the machinery of her old life was already beginning to hum. She called the first number. It rang 4 times, just long enough for a normal person to groan and fumble for the receiver, but Danny Reese wasn't a normal person. When he answered, his voice was sleep-ruffled for less than a second before snapping into a sharp, crystalline alertness. It was the particular readiness of a man trained to go from zero to fully operational in the time it took to draw a breath. Harper, Danny said, no greeting, no confusion, just her name. I need you, she said. There was a 2-second pause, the time it took for Danny to calculate the gravity of her voice. What level? I don't know yet, but probably not low. When? Soon. Maybe 48 hours. I'll be there in the morning, he said. There was no negotiation. No questions about his private security firm in Phoenix, no mention of his clients or his schedule. It was an uncomplicated, immediate commitment, a loyalty that had been decided upon years ago and never revised. You okay? He asked. 8 stitches, she said. I'm fine. Get some sleep. I'll brief you in the morning. She hung up and moved to the next name, Kai Nakamura. He had been their EOD specialist, a man who could dismantle a complex pressure plate IED in a sandstorm without his pulse rising above 60. He answered on the first ring. He was in Seattle now, and according to the rumors, he never really slept anyway. He was watching the late-night news when she called. I was waiting for you to call, Kai said, his tone a mix of exasperated affection and grim realization. I saw the footage from the bar. Nice hip throw, by the way. You're getting slow on the follow-up, though. I'll work on it, Harper said. Can you get here? I'm already looking at flights, he replied. Finally, she called Brianna Solano in Denver. Brianna was the ghost in the machine, a logistics and intelligence specialist who could find a needle in a haystack and then tell you exactly which sheep the needle had come from. She was the person Harper trusted more than anyone else to find the information that was meant to stay buried. By midnight, all 3 had confirmed. The team that had not functioned as a unit for 2 years was reassembling itself across 3 time zones. It happened with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a predator waking from a long slumber. There was no fanfare, just the urgent pivot from civilian life back into the older, more practiced shapes of warriors. Walter watched her finish the calls, his expression unreadable. When she finally set the phone down, he didn't offer a platitude. Instead, he reached for the folder again. There's something else, he said. He opened it to a specific, flagged page. The Equipment Colts network has been moving. It's not just small arms and encrypted radios. Harper leaned in, her eyes scanning the manifest. 3 weeks ago, a shipment moved through the San Diego port. It included 6 SMAW-D rocket systems and approximately 40,000 rounds of 7.62 NATO ammunition. Harper felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. That's not security contracting hardware, she whispered. That's conflict-level equipment. That's enough to start a small war or end a large one. Yes, Walter agreed. Who is the buyer? That, Walter said, is the question that's been keeping me up for 3 weeks. Harper looked at the documents spread across her grandfather's table. A familiar feeling began to settle into her bones, not a comfortable one, but one she recognized. It was the weight of a mission, the feeling of a problem that had a specific shape and required a specific solution. Underneath the anger and the physical pain of her injury, there was a sense of being exactly where her training had always intended her to be. She hated that it felt right. She hated the gravity of the violence that was coming, and yet she was profoundly grateful for the clarity it provided. Get some sleep, Walter said, standing up. Your team arrives in the morning. We plan then. You're not going to tell me to stay out of it, she asked, looking up at him. I tried that with your grandmother once, he said, a ghost of a smile appearing in his beard. It didn't work then either. He gathered their coffee cups and took them to the sink. The bedrooms are made up. I'll be up at 5. Harper didn't sleep until 2:00 a.m., and even then it wasn't the deep sleep of the innocent. She slept in layers, one part of her brain always awake, listening to the house settle, tracking the sound of the wind, always aware of the distance to the door. At 5:47 the next morning, Harper was already back at the kitchen table. The house smelled of strong coffee and the salt air drifting in from the coast. Her phone lit up with a call from Detective Marsh. "Morning," Marsh said. She sounded like she had been awake for hours, her voice raspy and strained. Derek Voss lawyered up at midnight. His attorney is already arguing self-defense and provocation. They're trying to characterize your response at the bar as disproportionate. Disproportionate, Harper repeated, the word tasting like ash. He drew a knife. His words, not mine, Marsh said. The attorney is good, private hire, top tier. Someone is paying a lot of money to keep Voss's mouth shut. There was a pointed pause on the line. His friends, the ones without records, were released an hour ago. The 2 with priors are still being held. Which 2? Marcus Holt, the one you put on his back. He's got 2 prior assault charges and a weapons possession from 4 years ago. And a man named Cole Webb. He has a dishonorable discharge from the Army and a sealed federal file that nobody will talk to me about. Harper grabbed a legal pad and wrote the names down. What about the phone call? The one Voss took before he approached me? We tracked it, Marsh said. It was a burner phone purchased in cash in Chula Vista 6 days ago. Another pause, heavier this time. 6 days ago, Harper, not yesterday, not an hour before the fight. Someone knew you were going to be at that bar nearly a week before it happened. The kitchen felt very still. Someone has been trailing me, Harper said. I don't know how else to read that. Neither do I, Marsh replied, which is why I'm calling you now instead of waiting for the precinct to open. I need you to tell me what you know. Not what you suspect, not what your gut says. What do you actually know? Harper looked at Walter's folder, the secret manifest, the names of international arms dealers, and the face of Raymond Colt. She thought about what Marsh needed to do her job, but she also thought about the limitations of the law. If she gave this to the police now, the red tape would descend. Jurisdictions would clash, evidence would be suppressed, and Colt's network would vanish into the ether the moment a squad car pulled up to the wrong warehouse. I know that the men at the bar were not random, Harper said carefully, choosing each word like a stepping stone across a torrent. I know that someone has been monitoring my consulting work. I know that a file on a logistics company I audited 3 months ago is the key. She took a breath. I'm going to need 24 hours before I give you the full picture. Not to obstruct, but because I don't have the full picture yet. I want to give you something you can actually use in court. Marsh was silent for a long time. 24 hours, she finally said, and then you give me everything. Everything I can give you legally, Harper countered. Don't make me regret this, Harper, Marsh said, and then added, the media is outside the hospital looking for you. They don't know you've been discharged yet. Use that window while you have it. The call ended just as a car pulled into the gravel driveway. Danny Reese arrived at 8:15 a.m., having driven straight from the airport after a red-eye from Phoenix. He was 6'2", lean and corded with the kind of muscle that only came from a decade of SEAL conditioning. He walked through the door with a duffel bag and 2 coffees, handing one to Harper without a word. He looked at the bandage on her head for exactly 1 second, a flash of cold anger crossing his face before it was replaced by professional focus. The other guys? He asked, nodding toward the documents. Hospital and jail, she said. Good. Danny sat down and the easy morning demeanor vanished. He picked up the shipping manifest and began to read, his eyes moving with rhythmic precision. Kai Nakamura arrived 40 minutes later, quieter and more deliberate. He embraced Harper briefly, then inspected her stitches with the critical eye of a man used to delicate repairs. That's going to scar, he noted. I know, she said. Good, Kai replied. You've earned it. By 9:00 a.m., Brianna Solano was on a secure video link from Denver. Her face was illuminated by the blue light of 3 different monitors. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, but her voice was sharp. Raymond Colt, she began without preamble, discharged 14 months ago. The official reason is conduct unbecoming, which is usually code for something the Navy didn't want to explain to a congressional committee. His finances since then are fascinating. He has a consulting LLC called Vanguard Resource Group. It's an aggressively boring name, which is always a red flag. In the last 10 months, Vanguard has received wire transfers totaling $2 million from 4 different shell corporations. 3 million? Danny whistled. 2, Brianna corrected. And that's just the money moving through the channels I can see. The actual number is likely double that. She typed something, and a new document appeared on the shared screen. I think I found the buyer for those rocket systems. There's a shell company in Cyprus that appears as a counterparty on several of Colt's transfers. It traces back to a man named Andrew Ballon. He's Ukrainian, based in Warsaw, and he's been on an Interpol yellow notice for arms dealing since 2019. Walter set his coffee down, his face hardening. An arms dealer buying American hardware through a disgraced seal, he murmured. And using domestic muscle to monitor anyone who gets close to the supply chain, Harper added. Which is exactly what happened when I did that audit. I wasn't supposed to notice the discrepancies. When I did, they flagged me and sent Voss to see if I was a loose end that needed tying. Which means they now know the threat level is significantly higher than they anticipated, Kai said. Everyone looked at Harper. She felt the weight of their gaze, the expectation of leadership that had never truly gone away. She thought about the voice on the phone. You should have stayed home tonight, Harper. She thought about the families who would be caught in the crossfire of the weapons Colt was selling. She thought about the 40,000 rounds of ammunition moving through her city. We need to find the next shipment, Harper said, and we need to find it before Colt knows we're coming. I can get that, Brianna said. Give me 12 hours. You have 8, Harper replied. Brianna offered a thin, satisfied smile. Even better. The house transformed. It was no longer a retirement home for an old sailor. It was a tactical operations center. Walter cleared the kitchen table and spread out topographical maps of the San Diego coastline. Danny began an inventory of the gear he had brought, checking optics and batteries. Kai sat with a legal pad, his pen moving in neat, systematic columns as he calculated the variables of an assault on a hardened facility. Harper stood by the window, staring out at the horizon. Her head ached with a rhythmic, pulsing throb, but she welcomed it. It was a reminder of the stakes. Her phone buzzed again. It was Madison. Harper, the news is outside Murphy's, Madison said, her voice trembling. They have your name, your full name, your service history. The video of the fight is on the national morning shows. Someone leaked that you were a SEAL. It's everywhere. Are you safe? I'm safe, Madison, Harper said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'm at Walter's. Thank God, Madison breathed. But Harper, there's something else. I went back to the bar to get my jacket this morning. Pete was there cleaning up. He told me that one of the men, the young one, the one who sat on the floor when you told him to, he came back after the police left. Harper's grip on the phone tightened. What did he say? Pete said he looked terrified. He asked if you were okay. And then he told Pete to tell you. Tell her they're not done. Tell her Colt doesn't leave loose ends. The kitchen went still. Harper processed the information. One of the men was scared enough to return, scared enough of Colt to risk being seen, yet desperate enough to deliver a warning. It was a crack in the facade. I need Pete to pull the security footage from after the police left, Harper said. I already asked, Madison said. He said whatever you need. People are calling you a hero, Harper. I'm not a hero, Harper said quietly. I'm just someone who was paying attention. Sometimes that's the same thing, Madison replied before hanging up. Harper turned back to the room. The world was closing in. The media was hunting for a story, the police were hunting for a statement, and Raymond Colt was hunting for a ghost. She had 8 hours before Brianna found the location, 24 hours before she had to talk to Marsh, and maybe 48 hours before the network vanished forever. She sat down at the table and pulled the nearest document toward her. It was time to go to work. At 4:53 p.m., the silence of the kitchen was broken by the sharp chirp of Brianna's return call. She hadn't taken 8 hours. She had taken 7 hours and 12 minutes. I found it, Brianna said, her voice crackling with the electric energy of a successful hunt. There's a warehouse in National City, about 7 miles south of downtown. It's registered to a shell called Pacific Rim Storage Solutions. It's been leased for 11 months. She paused, the sound of rapid typing audible over the line. The next movement is tonight. Based on the communication intercepts I pulled, and don't ask how, there is a truck scheduled to leave that warehouse at 11 o'clock p.m. It's bound for a container vessel at the 10th Avenue Marine Terminal. The vessel departs at 2 o'clock a.m. Harper looked at Danny and Kai. They were already watching her, their expressions unreadable but their bodies coiled with intent. How confident are you? Harper asked. 90%, Brianna said. The only variable is whether Colt has moved the timeline because of the bar fight. If he's spooked, that truck could leave any minute. We have to treat it as a live target. What's the security? Minimum 4 personnel on site, Brianna said, likely more given the value of the cargo. And here's the kicker. Colt made a phone call this morning to a lobbyist in D.C. named Gerald Finch. Finch represents defense contractors and has ties to the House Armed Services Committee. Walter looked up from his maps. He has cover, he said. Someone in Washington is keeping the door open for him. The picture was growing, the edges darkening as the corruption reached higher into the halls of power. But Harper knew they couldn't fight the battle in D.C. tonight. They could only fight the battle in front of them. Send me everything, she told Brianna. Layouts, entry points, everything. The team moved. Danny and Kai began the final checks on their equipment. There was a grim, silent professionalism to their movements, a synchronization that came from years of shared danger. They were no longer civilians, they were a unit. National City, Harper said, looking at the map. A warehouse, 4 guards, 1 truck. 4 of us, Walter said from the head of the table. Harper looked at him. He was 71 years old. He had a knee that clicked when he walked and a lifetime of scars. She started to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't the look of a grandfather, it was the look of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had never once blinked. You stay back, she said, her voice firm. Command and coordination. You don't go into the warehouse. Agreed, Walter said, a little too quickly. Danny stepped outside to make a call. When he came back, his face was set. I called a guy I know at NCIS, he said. We need someone official in the loop. If we go in there and start a firefight without any government backing, we're just criminals. We need a way to make sure the evidence sticks and we don't end up in a federal holding cell. He was right. The transition from military operations to domestic intervention was a legal minefield. In a war zone, the mission was the only law. Here, they were operating in a world of rules that their enemies were expertly subverting. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the kitchen floor. They spent the next hour refining the approach. Kai was methodical, pointing out the likely locations for motion sensors and cameras. Danny focused on the tactical entry, identifying the fatal funnels and the quickest routes to the cargo. Every contingency was discussed. Every variable was weighed. They were preparing for a raid on a facility that was likely booby-trapped, guarded by professional mercenaries and overseen by a man who had nothing left to lose. As they packed the last of their gear into the back of Walter's SUV, the air turned cold. The reality of what they were about to do settled over them, a heavy, quiet weight. They were heading into the dark to face a man who had once been one of their own, a man who had turned his back on everything they believed in. Harper looked at her team. They were older now, perhaps a little slower, but the fire was still there. The same fire that had kept them alive in places the world had forgotten. She climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Let's go," she said. The drive to National City was a blur of streetlights and highway signs. No one spoke. The silence was tactical, a way of narrowing their focus until only the mission remained. As they approached the industrial district, the world changed. The neat suburban houses gave way to vast, windowless warehouses and towering stacks of shipping containers. The air smelled of diesel and salt. They found the warehouse at the end of a dead-end street, a massive concrete box draped in shadow. A single light flickered over the loading dock. There was no sign of life, but Harper could feel the presence of the men inside. She could feel the vibration of the machinery, the hum of the conspiracy. She parked the SUV 2 blocks away, and they moved in on foot, ghosts in the night. The bandage on her head felt like a crown of lead, but she pushed the pain down, burying it under the cold necessity of the moment. They reached the perimeter fence, and Kai went to work on the lock. "We're in," he whispered. They slipped through the gate and vanished into the darkness. The hunt had begun. The warehouse was an island of industry in a sea of silence. Every footstep felt like a hammer blow against the asphalt, though they moved with the practiced grace of shadows. Danny took the lead, his eyes scanning the rooftops and the dark corners of the loading bays. Kai was right behind him, his focus on the ground, looking for the telltale signs of a tripwire or a pressure sensor. Harper brought up the rear, her hand hovering near her side, her senses tuned to the frequency of the night. They reached the side entrance, a heavy steel door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Kai knelt, pulling a small kit from his vest. He didn't use a crowbar or an explosive charge. He used a set of picks with the delicacy of a surgeon. The lock clicked. a sound so faint it was swallowed by the distant rumble of a passing train. They slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of crates and steel racking. The air was cool and smelled of grease and cold metal. High above, a few dim security lights cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. In the center of the space sat a nondescript semi-truck, its trailer already hitched and ready to move. Two men were standing near the cab, talking in low voices. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their posture gave them away. They stood with the balanced weight of men who carried weapons for a living. Danny signaled for a split. He and Kai moved to the left, flanking the truck through the maze of crates. Harper moved to the right, using a stack of pallets as cover. Her heart was steady, her breath shallow and controlled. As she moved, she saw the cargo. Several crates had been left open, revealing the sleek olive-drab tubes of the Small D rocket systems. Beside them were rows of ammunition cans, stacked high and ready for transport. This wasn't just a shipment, it was an arsenal. She reached the edge of the pallet stack and stopped. One of the guards turned, his hand moving toward his waistband. He had sensed something, a shift in the air, a sound out of place. Harper didn't wait. She stepped from the shadows, the movement fluid and explosive. Before the guard could draw his weapon, she was on him. She didn't use a gun, she used the momentum of his own surprise. She caught his wrist, twisting it with a sickening pop, and drove her palm into his chin. He went down without a sound. Across the warehouse, the second guard reached for his radio, but Danny was already there. He took the man down with a clinical efficiency, a sleeper hold that ended the fight before it could truly begin. Clear, Danny whispered into his comms, but Harper wasn't looking at the guards. She was looking at the small office overlooking the warehouse floor. The light inside was on, and a figure was standing at the window. It was Raymond Colt. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had been expecting a guest. He picked up a microphone, and his voice boomed through the warehouse speakers, distorted and metallic. "I told you to stay home, Harper," he said. "You should have listened." The doors at the far end of the warehouse began to slide open, revealing more men, armed men. The light from the outside flooded in, blinding for a split second. "It's a trap," Kai shouted. Harper dived behind a crate as the first volley of gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening, the bullets chewing into the wood and metal around her. She looked at Danny and Kai, who were already returning fire, their movements a choreographed dance of suppression and cover. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a box of their own making. But as Harper looked up at the office where Colt stood, she felt a surge of cold, pure clarity. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't just a consultant. She was a sailor who had found her way back to the sea, and she wasn't leaving until the job was done. She reached into her vest and pulled out a flashbang. She looked at Danny, caught his eye, and nodded. "Cover me," she said. The warehouse exploded into chaos, but in the center of the storm, Harper was calm. The mission had a shape now, and she knew exactly how to break it. The flashbang detonated with a bone-shaking roar, a white-hot bloom of light that seared the shadows from the corners of the warehouse. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but static and brilliance. Harper moved before the sound had even faded. She wasn't running, she was flowing, a dark shape cutting through the haze of smoke and disorientation. She heard the panicked shouts of Colt's men as they scrambled to find their bearings. Danny and Kai were already capitalizing on the chaos, their shots rhythmic and precise, picking targets with the cold efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 worse places. They weren't shooting to kill unless they had to. They were shooting to disable, to sow more confusion, to keep the enemy's heads down. Harper reached the metal stairs leading up to the office. She didn't take them one by one. She surged up, her boots clattering on the steel. A man appeared at the top, his face a mask of blind rage as he tried to clear his eyes. He leveled a submachine gun, but Harper was under his guard before he could pull the trigger. She drove her shoulder into his solar plexus, feeling the air leave his lungs in a sharp wheeze, and then spun him toward the railing. He tumbled over, landing hard on a stack of crates below. She didn't stop to watch him fall. She kicked the office door open. The room was small, smelling of stale coffee and expensive tobacco. Raymond Colt sat behind a desk, a heavy semi-automatic pistol resting near his hand, but he wasn't holding it. He was watching a bank of monitors that showed the chaos on the warehouse floor. He looked up as Harper entered, his expression one of weary disappointment. "You have a lot of talent," Harper, Colt said, his voice calm despite the gunfire echoing below. "It's a shame you're wasting it on a world that doesn't care if you live or die." "I care," Harper said, her voice like a whetstone. "And the people you're selling those rockets to?" They care, just not in the way you think. Colt chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. You think this is about the hardware. The hardware is just the currency. This is about leverage. This is about making sure that when the world finally falls apart, I'm the one holding the keys to the shelter. He finally reached for the gun, but Harper was faster. She didn't draw her own weapon. She flipped the heavy desk, the wood groaning as it slammed into Colt, pinning him against the wall. The monitors shattered, raining glass and sparks onto the floor. Colt struggled, his face reddening as he tried to shove the desk back, but Harper leaned her full weight against it. She looked him in the eye, seeing the man he had been and the monster he had become. "The police are 5 minutes out," she said. "And the NCIS team Danny called? They're right behind them. There is no leverage, Raymond. There's just you, me, and a very long sentence in a very small cell." Colt looked at her, his eyes darting to the broken monitors. He realized then that the tide had turned. The men he had hired were being systematically dismantled by 2 operators who didn't know how to quit. The shipment was compromised. The network was unraveling. He stopped struggling and leaned his head back against the wall, a grimace of defeat crossing his face. "You think you've won?" he whispered. "You've just made yourself a target for people much more powerful than me." "I've been a target my whole life," Harper said. "I'm used to it." The sound of sirens began to bleed into the warehouse, the high-pitched wail of authority cutting through the industrial gloom. Below, the gunfire had stopped. Danny's voice came over the comms, clear and steady. "Area secure, Harper. We've got the survivors tied up. The truck isn't going anywhere." Harper stepped back, letting the desk settle. Colt slumped to the floor, his professional mask finally cracking. He looked old. He looked tired. She walked out of the office and onto the catwalk, looking down at the warehouse floor. Danny and Kai were standing by the crates of rockets, their silhouettes sharp against the blue and red lights flashing through the open doors. Walter was there too, standing by the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of quiet pride on his face. Harper felt the adrenaline begin to recede, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. Her head throbbed, her stitches pulled, and her body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. But as she descended the stairs, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since she turned in her trident. She walked out into the cool night air, the salt spray of the Pacific hitting her face. Detective Marsh was there, stepping out of a squad car, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "You're late," Harper said, leaning against the brick wall of the warehouse. 24 hours, Marsh said, checking her watch. "You're early." Harper looked back at the warehouse, at the crates of weapons that would never reach their destination, at the team that had come back together when she needed them most. She looked at the ocean, vast and indifferent, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a choice. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs, and started to walk. There was still work to be done, stories to be told, and a long road ahead. But for tonight, the mission was over. She was going home. The map spread across the scarred wooden table was a topography of risks and variables. Every line Brianna had drawn represented a potential killing floor or a narrow window of opportunity. They didn't just talk about the doors, they dissected them. The hinges, the weight, the line of sight from the interior. Communication protocols were established with the cold, rhythmic efficiency of a pre-flight checklist. They discussed the what-ifs like they were old enemies. What if the timeline shifted? What if the cargo was already boxed and moving? What if the personnel count doubled? Harper didn't just listen, she interrogated the plan. She pushed back against Danny's assumptions, refining the angles until the uncertainty was bled dry. A good plan wasn't about being sure of success. It was about shrinking the geography of failure until it was a target they could hit. The air in the room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the electric hum of focused intent. Danny had slipped out to make the final connections, and when he returned at 5:48 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood by the door, his silhouette framed by the fading evening light. He told them the name of their new ally, Special Agent Torres. It was a name that carried weight in certain circles, but it wasn't the one they expected. Danny clarified that it was a different Torres, one who had been quietly tracking unauthorized military equipment transfers for 6 months. When Colt's name had been mentioned, Torres had gone silent for 4 heavy seconds. It was the silence of a hunter who realized someone else had stumbled onto the same scent. Danny finally pulled out a chair, the screech of wood against the floor sounding like a starting pistol. Torres wanted in. He and his partner wouldn't just be watching from a distance, they wanted to coordinate the arrest. Harper leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she processed the change. She made the terms clear. They provide the access, but her team goes in first. Danny nodded, confirming that while Torres didn't love the arrangement, he wasn't in a position to argue. He had seen the footage from the tavern. He knew what Harper was capable of when the glass started breaking, and he wasn't about to get in the way of a professional who was already moving at full speed. Something that was almost amusement, a rare flicker of light, moved through Kai's dark eyes. The silence that followed was shattered by the buzzing of Harper's phone. It was an unknown number, and as it vibrated against the table, Harper felt her chest tighten by exactly 1 degree. It was a physical reaction, a tightening of the coil. She answered with a voice that was a wall of flint. The voice on the other end was different from the one she had heard the night before. It was older, polished to a high sheen, the voice of a man who had spent decades in mahogany offices and command centers, someone accustomed to being the final word in any room. He introduced himself as Raymond Colt, and the room went absolutely still. Danny's hand moved instinctively toward the phone, a silent request to hear the man who had been a ghost in their investigation. Harper tilted the device, allowing the smooth, calculated tones to spill into the room. Colt started with a compliment, a classic tactic of the high-level manipulator. He spoke of Harper's speed and her grandfather Walter's reputation. He called Walter a thorough man and claimed to respect his work. It was a calculated pause, a verbal signature intended to communicate that he knew exactly who they were and where they were. He claimed he wanted to resolve the situation without further bloodshed, framing the previous night's violence as a miscalculation by a subordinate named Derek. Harper listened, her face a mask of iron. She wasn't listening for the lies, she was listening for the truth hidden behind them. Every second Colt talked was a data point. He spoke of pragmatic foreign policy and operations that served purposes beyond the public eye. He tried to paint the illegal movement of advanced weaponry as a necessary evil, a way to support allies the government couldn't officially acknowledge. When Harper mentioned the Ukrainian arms dealer acting as the middleman, there was a brief, telling silence. Colt realized she wasn't just a blunt instrument. She was an investigator who had already peeled back the first layer of his operation. The conversation shifted from justification to a demand. Colt wanted her to stand down. He offered a clean exit. If she walked away, the shipment would move at 2:00 a.m., and by tomorrow, the whole affair would be a shadow in the rearview mirror. He transitioned seamlessly from a bribe to a threat. He spoke of his legal resources and his deep-rooted relationships in Washington. He promised to make her transition back to civilian life considerably easier with consulting contracts and government ties. Real work, as he called it, not the mundane auditing of shipping manifests. He was offering her a seat at a table she had spent her life protecting from people exactly like him. Harper didn't interrupt. She let him exhaust his script. Across the table, Walter watched her, his coffee cup held steady in his weathered hands. His eyes never left hers, offering a silent support that was worth more than any Washington contract. When Colt finished, Harper asked the only question that mattered to her. She didn't ask about the money or the legal immunity. She asked about the destination. The weapons on that vessel, the small systems and the mountains of ammunition, where would they end up? Who would be on the receiving end of that hardware once the middleman moved it forward? The silence on the other end of the line was cold. Colt didn't have an answer that would satisfy a woman who had seen the impact of those weapons firsthand. Harper made it clear that her calculation wasn't based on career or complications. It was based on the bodies those weapons would eventually create. When Colt spoke again, the smoothness was gone. The polished exterior had cracked, revealing the hard, jagged edges of the man beneath. He told her she was making a mistake. Harper countered that it probably wasn't her first, but her decision was made. She recommended he make his, and then she ended the call. The air in the room seemed to rush back in as she put the phone down. Danny exhaled through his teeth, the sound of a man who knew the fuse had just been lit. Colt knew they were coming. He had known before he even dialed her number. Harper explained that the call wasn't a peace offering, it was an assessment. He wanted to hear the cadence of her voice to see if she was bluffing. She wasn't. Kai pointed out the obvious. Colt would move the timeline. They had to move theirs. Harper looked at the clock. It was 6:14 p.m. They would leave at 8 and be on site by 9. Whatever was brewing in that warehouse, they would see it before the clock struck 11. Walter stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He would drive. The next 2 hours were a blur of compressed, purposeful energy. It was the frantic yet disciplined rhythm of people preparing for a storm. They checked their equipment with practiced hands, The slide of a magazine, the adjustment of a strap, the testing of a radio. Brianna's diagrams were reviewed one last time, the ink etched into their memories. Communication protocols with Torres were locked in. He confirmed his team would be positioned 2 blocks out, waiting for Harper's signal to move. Brianna called twice with updates, her voice rising in urgency. A vehicle had arrived at 6:40 p.m., followed by another at 7:20. The loadout was accelerating. They were consolidating ahead of schedule, pulling the departure time up from 11 o'clock p.m. to perhaps as early as 9:30. They were in Walter's truck by 7:31 p.m. The engine rumbled, a low growl in the quiet neighborhood. Walter was behind the wheel, Harper in the passenger seat, with Danny and Kai in the back. They were silent, wrapped in the focused, heavy quiet of people who had spent their lives moving toward hard things. They had made their peace with the potential outcomes long ago. The drive should have taken 40 minutes, but Walter, driven by an unspoken urgency, did it in 33. He pulled the truck to a halt 4 blocks from the warehouse at 8:04 p.m. Harper was out of the door before the tires had stopped turning. The cold night air hit her like a physical weight, but she welcomed it. Her body was already running a subconscious systems check. Her breathing was rhythmic, her vision sharp, her heart rate elevated but controlled. The headache under her bandage was a dull, persistent throb, but she logged it as a minor inconvenience and moved past it. She contacted Torres, informing him they were 4 blocks out. He was in position with 2 vehicles and 6 agents, holding for her signal. She gave a sharp nod to Danny and Kai, and they began their approach. The walk toward the warehouse was a masterclass in tactical geometry. They moved through the shadows of the San Diego industrial block, blending into the darkness. When they reached the perimeter at 8:17 p.m., the reality on the ground shattered their initial plan. There weren't 4 people inside, there were at least 8. Harper watched the movement through the upper ventilation windows, the shadows crossing back and forth with the frantic rhythm of people working against a deadline. 2 vehicles were backed up to the loading door, and a third, a black SUV, sat to the side. It was a new variable, something Brianna hadn't seen. Kai drifted to her left, his voice a ghost of a whisper. He noted the SUV. It could be Colt or someone just as dangerous. Danny was on her right, his mind reaching the same conclusion she had. 8-3 changed the math. It changed the entire approach, but the objective remained the same. Harper called Torres again, updating the estimate and requesting immediate backup for the east exit. If those vehicles started moving, the shipment would be lost before the feds could react. Torres hesitated for 2 seconds before committing his people. He promised they would be there in 4 minutes. Harper told him he had 3. The warehouse was a hive of activity. Outside, a man called out to someone inside, his voice carrying on the wind but his words lost to the distance. A door slammed. The rhythm of the work was frantic, the sound of people who no longer felt they were in control of their own timeline. At 8:21 p.m., Torres confirmed the east exit was covered. Harper looked at her team. No words were needed. They were ready. She gave the order and they moved. The entry was a sudden, violent burst of precision. Danny took the side access door with the fluid grace of a shadow. Kai moved toward the loading bay and Harper went through the front. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the direct, forward momentum of someone who knew that speed was the best defense. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of noise. Shouted orders, the metallic clatter of equipment, the heavy thud of crates being shifted. For 2 full seconds, the chaos worked in her favor. No one noticed her entry. She used those seconds to survey the landscape, identifying the threats and the exits. Then the world exploded. Torres's voice boomed from the east end, announcing the presence of federal agents and demanding everyone freeze. The room didn't erupt in gunfire, but in a chaotic, desperate panic. Men who had been in the middle of an illegal act scattered like insects when a light is turned on. They collided with equipment and each other, their frantic movements creating a sea of noise. One man tried to bolt for the loading bay, but Kai was already there, a silent sentinel blocking his path. Harper moved through the turmoil with the same cold, efficient precision she had displayed at the tavern. This was a larger stage, but the principles were the same. She used her voice as a weapon, directing and controlling the flow of people, using her body only when necessary to cut off an escape angle. Her focus was absolute. And then she saw him, the man from the black SUV. He was in his mid-50s with a square jaw and a face she recognized from the files in Walter's folder. Raymond Colt. Unlike the others, Colt wasn't panicking. He wasn't running. He was moving with a calculated, deliberate calm toward a side door that hadn't been on any of their diagrams, a hidden exit, likely a private addition to the building. He had a phone in his hand, his eyes fixed on that door with the singular focus of a man who had already rehearsed his escape. Harper's voice cut through the din like a blade. She called his name, and for the first time, he stopped. Colt turned to look at her. The expression on his face wasn't fear. It was something far more unsettling. It was recognition. It was the look of a seasoned professional who was finally meeting the person he had been studying from afar. He spoke her name, his voice quiet against the backdrop of shouts and clattering crates. He sounded almost impressed. Harper didn't return the sentiment. She ordered him to drop the phone. Colt looked at the device, then back at her, and with the resignation of a man who had already calculated the legal odds, he set it down on a nearby crate. He tried one last time to frame the narrative. He told her it wasn't what it looked like. Harper told him she knew exactly what it was, and she had 9 months of documentation to prove it. Torres appeared at her side, his badge glinting in the harsh warehouse lights, flanked by 2 agents. Colt looked at the federal presence, then back at Harper. She saw the moment the realization finally sank in. The math had returned the same result every time he ran it. It was over. Torres announced the arrest, and Colt slowly raised his hands. Even as the handcuffs clicked shut, he kept his eyes on Harper. He repeated the words from the phone call that she should have stayed home, but the tone was different. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a weary acknowledgement of her skill. The warehouse was slowly being brought under control. Agents moved through the space, securing the area and documenting the scene. 6 men were already in zip ties on the floor, and 2 more were being brought in from the east exit. The loading doors of the vehicles remained open, revealing crates marked with deceptive labels, civilian goods meant to hide the tools of war. Each crate was a victory, a piece of evidence that validated Walter's weeks of solitary work and Brianna's technical wizardry. Danny appeared at Harper's shoulder, reporting a clean sweep. No one had escaped. Harper asked about the vessel, and Danny confirmed that Torres had agents at the marine terminal. The ship wasn't going anywhere. Kai joined them, looking over the room in silence. He eventually noted that Brianna would want a full debrief. Harper agreed, her phone buzzing in her pocket. It was Walter. She answered immediately, telling him it was done. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that held 2 decades of retired life and 3 weeks of secret investigation. Walter's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, asking how clean it was. When she told him it was very clean, he simply said, "Good." It was the word of a man who had risked his granddaughter's life for the right reasons and was finally allowed to breathe. Torres found her 10 minutes later. He was a man who looked like he had seen too much and said too little. He stood with Harper, surveying the scene of the bust they had just executed. He admitted that his team had been working on this for 6 months, yet she had pulled it together in 24 hours. Harper gave credit to her team, but Torres knew better. He told her he would need everything her source had compiled for the federal case. He also warned her that the investigation would lead to uncomfortable places in Washington, particularly involving the lobbyist Gerald Finch. Harper thought back to Colt's offer, the easy life, the consulting contracts, and realized why they had never tempted her. She had seen the end of the supply chain. She knew what those weapons did. She told Torres she was ready for whatever came next. As they walked out into the night, Walter's truck pulled up. Harper, Danny, and Kai stood in the sudden quiet that follows a completed mission. It was a different kind of silence, one that felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had been accomplished. Danny looked up at the stars and made a joke about doing it again next week, drawing a rare, dry sound of amusement from Kai. Harper climbed into the passenger seat, and Walter looked at her. He saw the bandage, the torn jacket, and the deep exhaustion in her eyes, the kind of tired that only comes when you've given everything you have. He told her she did good, and she corrected him. They did good. As they drove away, the lights of the warehouse faded in the distance. The city around them was oblivious to what had transpired. People were going about their Friday nights, eating dinner, watching movies, unaware of the shipment of death that had been halted just a few miles away. Harper's phone buzzed again. It was Madison. Her voice was shaky, filled with the adrenaline of seeing her friend's name on the news. She asked if Harper was okay, really okay. Harper leaned her head back, the headache still pulsing behind her eyes. She watched the dark ocean on the horizon and told Madison that for the first time in a long time, she was both military okay and actually okay. Madison invited her over for a real breakfast the next day, and Harper accepted. As the truck moved through the city, Harper thought about the long road ahead. There would be investigations, debriefs, and testimonies. The political fallout from Gerald Finch's involvement would be messy and prolonged. The questions about how a man like Colt could operate for so long within the system would be asked in rooms she hadn't even entered yet. It wasn't a clean ending, those rarely existed in her world, but the immediate threat was neutralized. The weapons were stayed. The men were in custody. And somewhere in the world, the supply chain for a dangerous man had just been severed. That was enough for tonight. For the first time in years, Harper Dalton felt still. The morning light of Tuesday was thin and pale as it hit the San Diego coastline. Harper was 3 miles into her run, the rhythmic strike of her shoes against the pavement the only sound besides the distant crash of the waves. It was a familiar ritual, a way to process the static in her brain. But the static was different now. It wasn't the frantic noise of a pending mission. It was the slow, heavy settling of the aftermath. When her phone vibrated in her pocket, she didn't hesitate. She stopped, her breath coming in steady plumes in the chilly air, and looked at the screen. A federal detention facility. She answered, expecting a lawyer or perhaps Torres with another update on the filing. Instead, it was Colt. His voice was the same, yet fundamentally altered. The 3 days in a cell had stripped away the layer of corporate invincibility he had worn like armor. The man on the other end of the line sounded hollowed out. He told her his lawyer had advised against the call, but he was making it anyway. He didn't want to negotiate. He didn't have a strategy left to play. Colt spoke of the stories he had told himself. The pragmatic foreign policy, the necessary secrets, the idea that he was a patriot working in the shadows for the greater good. It was a story that had held up for 18 months, a narrative strong enough to convince the men who worked for him and the officials who turned a blind eye. But he admitted that Harper's question in the warehouse had stayed with him. When she asked where the weapons ended up, he realized he had known the answer all along. He had known the cost in lives, and he had kept moving the shipments anyway. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or a deal. He just needed to say it to someone who understood the weight of that truth. Harper stood on the path, the city on one side and the vast, indifferent ocean on the other. She didn't offer him comfort or condemnation. She simply listened. The silence between them was a bridge between two people who had both lived in the dark but had chosen different paths out of it. When the call ended, she didn't resume her run immediately. She looked out at the water, thinking about the fragility of the peace she was currently feeling. The world was still full of people like Colt, and there would always be another shipment, another shadow to chase. But as she started running again, her pace was steady, her heart was strong, and for the first time in her life, the path ahead looked clear. The news cycles continued to churn, turning her face into a symbol of a story she barely recognized. To the public, she was a hero, a decorated veteran who had taken down a corrupt system. To her, she was just a woman who had seen a problem and used every tool at her disposal to fix it. The reality was much grittier than the headlines. It was the smell of the warehouse, the sting of the stitches in her scalp, and the quiet, shared understanding in Walter's truck. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was as extensive as Torres had predicted. The connection to Gerald Finch sent shockwaves through Washington, leading to a series of closed-door hearings and high-profile resignations. The logistics chain Colt had exploited was dismantled, rebuilt with new layers of oversight that would, for a time at least, make such a scheme impossible. The Ukrainian middleman, Andrei Ballon, found his assets frozen and his influence evaporating as the federal government leveraged the evidence Harper's team had gathered. Throughout it all, Harper remained a figure of quiet intensity. She provided her testimony with the same precision she used in the field, her words a series of undeniable facts that left no room for legal maneuvering. She worked closely with Torres, helping his team navigate the complex military jargon and the hidden shortcuts Colt had used. They formed a professional respect that went beyond the initial friction of the warehouse raid. Madison remained her anchor. Those Saturday morning breakfasts became a staple, a time for Harper to disconnect from the world of federal investigations and political scandals. They talked about ordinary things, movies, books, the mundane details of life that Harper had ignored for so long. It was in those moments, over plates of eggs and carafes of coffee, that Harper felt the distance between her former life and her current one truly begin to bridge. Walter, too, seemed changed. The weight of the secret investigation he had carried for 3 weeks had been replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. He didn't talk much about the case, but there was a new light in his eyes, a sense of pride that didn't need to be spoken. They spent more time together, often in the quiet of his workshop or driving along the coast, the silence between them comfortable and full. Kai and Danny moved on to other things, their skills always in demand in a world that never stopped being dangerous. But they stayed in touch, a loose network of people who had been through the fire together and come out the other side. They were the ones who truly understood what had happened in that warehouse, the split-second decisions, the cold adrenaline, and the profound relief of a job well done. As the months passed, the intensity of the investigation began to fade. The headlines were replaced by newer, louder stories, and Harper's name slowly drifted from the public consciousness. She was fine with that. She had never sought the spotlight, she had only ever sought the mission. And the mission was complete. One evening, as the sun was setting over the Pacific, Harper sat on the pier, watching the colors bleed across the sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and the distant sound of the city. She thought about the path that had led her here, the years in the Navy, the trauma of her service, the transition to a life she hadn't known how to live. She thought about Colt and the choice he had made to trade his soul for influence. And she thought about herself and the choice she had made to keep fighting, even when the fight was personal. She realized then that being a hero wasn't about the awards or the recognition. It was about the moments of stillness, the quiet knowledge that you had done what was right, regardless of the cost. It was about being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that the calculation you were running was based on the truth. The headache from the warehouse raid was long gone, leaving only a faint silver scar beneath her hair, a permanent reminder of the night everything changed. She ran her fingers over it, a small smile touching her lips. She was 27 years old, and for the first time she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The world would always have its shadows, its hidden networks, and its men like Raymond Colt. There would always be weapons moving through the dark, destined for people who would use them for all the wrong reasons. But as long as there were people like Harper Dalton, people willing to step into that darkness and pull the threads until the whole thing unraveled, there was a chance for the light to break through. She stood up, the wooden planks of the pier creaking under her boots. She took a deep breath of the cold ocean air and started walking back toward the city. Her stride was confident, her eyes were sharp, and she was ready for whatever the next chapter held. The mission was over, but the work of living was just beginning. In the quiet of her apartment that night, she looked at the files one last time before locking them away. There were names, dates, and locations, the dry bones of a conspiracy that had almost succeeded. But behind those facts were the faces of the people she had protected, the lives that wouldn't be ended by the weapons she had stopped. That was the real evidence. That was the only record that mattered. She turned off the light, the room plunging into a soft, familiar darkness. But it wasn't a darkness of fear or uncertainty. It was the darkness of a world at rest, a world that was just a little bit safer because she had refused to stay home. And as she closed her eyes, the last thing she felt was the steady, rhythmic beating of a heart that was finally, truly at peace. The federal case against Raymond Colt moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. In the sterile environment of a courtroom, the high-stakes drama of the warehouse was reduced to a series of exhibits and testimonies. Harper watched from the gallery on the days she wasn't testifying, seeing the man who had tried to buy her soul sit in a cheap suit, his power stripped away by the very legal system he had thought he could manipulate. Colt never looked at her during the trial. He kept his gaze fixed on the judge or his attorneys, his face a mask of professional neutrality. But Harper knew what was behind that mask. She knew about the call from the detention facility, the moment of honesty that he couldn't take back. In the end, he was convicted on all counts, sentenced to a term that would ensure he would never again influence the movement of a single crate of equipment. Gerald Finch didn't escape the fallout either. While he managed to avoid the most severe criminal charges, his career in Washington was effectively over. The lobbyist who had built a life on access and influence found himself an outcast, his name synonymous with the corruption he had facilitated. It was a different kind of prison, but a prison nonetheless. Special Agent Torres was promoted, his persistence and the success of the raid earning him a leadership role in a new task force dedicated to monitoring military logistics. He and Harper remained in contact, occasionally sharing information on new threads that emerged from the wreckage of Colt's network. They were two sides of the same coin, working in their own ways to keep the system honest. Walter's role in the investigation remained a secret, known only to those who had been in the room. He preferred it that way. He didn't need the recognition. He only needed the knowledge that he had protected his family and his country one last time. He spent his days in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and the sound of his tools a soothing backdrop to his retirement. He and Harper grew closer than ever, their shared experience a bond that didn't need words to sustain it. Madison eventually moved on to a new job in a different city, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. They spoke often, the Saturday morning breakfasts replaced by long phone calls that bridged the distance. Madison was the one who reminded Harper that there was more to life than the mission, and Harper was the one who reminded Madison that some things were worth fighting for. Kai and Danny continued their work, their paths crossing with Harper's on occasion. They were the ghosts in the machine, the people who did the hard work that the world never saw. They were a reminder that the world was a dangerous place, but also that there were people willing to face that danger head-on. And then there was Harper. She didn't return to auditing manifests for mid-level logistics companies. Instead, she found a new path, one that allowed her to use her skills in a way that felt meaningful. She became a consultant for organizations that work to track and prevent the illegal flow of weapons in conflict zones around the world. It wasn't the easy civilian life Colt had offered, but it was a life of purpose. She spent her days analyzing data, identifying patterns, and working with international agencies to intercept shipments before they could reach their destinations. It was a global version of the work she had done in San Diego, a way to ensure that the calculation she had run in that warehouse continued to yield the same result. She still ran every morning, the rhythm of her feet against the pavement, a constant in her life. She still felt the pulse of the city and the call of the ocean, and she still carried the memories of everything she had seen and done. But the weight was lighter now, the shadows less daunting. 1 year after the raid, Harper stood on the deck of a research vessel in the Mediterranean, watching the sun rise over the water. She was there to coordinate with a maritime task force, part of an operation to stop a shipment of illicit hardware destined for a war-torn region. The air was salty and cold, the hum of the ship's engines a familiar vibration under her feet. She looked out at the horizon, her eyes sharp and focused. She knew the risks, she knew the variables, and she knew the potential cost. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had a team, she had a mission, and she had the truth on her side. As the first light of day touched the water, Harper Dalton felt a sense of profound clarity. The path she had walked, the choices she had made, the battles she had fought, they had all led her to this moment. She was no longer just a veteran trying to find her way in a world she didn't understand. She was a woman who had found her place in the fight, a woman who knew that the most important calculation of all was the one that favored the innocent. The world was vast and complex, and the shadows would always be there. But as the sun rose higher, casting its light across the waves, Harper knew that she would always be there too, standing in the gap, ready to do whatever it took to keep the darkness at bay. And that was more than enough. The journey from the dark corners of a San Diego warehouse to the global stage of international arms tracking had been long and difficult. It had tested her in ways she couldn't have imagined, and it had forced her to confront the deepest parts of herself. But in the end, it had made her stronger, more resilient, and more certain of her purpose. She thought of Walter, sitting in his workshop thousands of miles away. She thought of Madison, living her life in a new city. She thought of Danny and Kai out there somewhere in the shadows. And she thought of Special Agent Torres continuing the work they had started together. They were all part of a larger story, a story of people who refused to look away, people who chose to act when it mattered most. The ship moved forward, cutting through the waves with a steady, purposeful rhythm. Harper watched the horizon, her mind already running the next set of calculations, the next series of variables. She was ready. She was operational, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The legacy of the Colt investigation lived on, not just in the legal records and the political reforms, but in the lives of the people who had been touched by it. It was a reminder that even in a world of complex interests and hidden agendas, a single person with the courage to seek the truth could make a difference. As the vessel moved toward its destination, the light of the new day grew stronger, illuminating the path ahead. Harper took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and felt a sense of peace that was as deep and vast as the ocean itself. The mission continued, the work never truly ended, but for the first time she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The shadows would always be there, but so would she. And in that simple truth there was all the hope she needed. The calculation was complete, the result was certain, and the path was clear. Harper Dalton was home, even when she was thousands of miles away. She was at peace, even when she was in the middle of the fight. And she was, as she had always been, a woman of her word. The silence on the other end of the line was not empty. It was a heavy, pressurized thing, the kind of silence that exists in the seconds between a lightning strike and the thunder that follows. Harper stood on the edge of the Pacific, the salt spray catching in her hair, her lungs still burning from the final stretch of her run. In her hand, the phone felt strangely light, a plastic and glass conduit for a conversation that was dismantling a man's entire existence. Colt had asked her what it meant to know something, to see the same darkness she had seen, and to keep going anyway. He wanted to know why she hadn't stopped where he had. He wanted to know the exact coordinate where their paths had diverged, even though they had both been forged in the same fire. Harper looked out at the horizon, where the gray blue of the water met the hazy morning sky. She didn't answer immediately. She wanted the words to be as precise as a marksman's shot. "The difference," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins, "is that I still believe the training was for something. It wasn't for whoever had the deepest pockets or the most influence. It was for something that doesn't change just because the contract does." There was another long silence, this one more hollow. Colt didn't argue. He didn't offer a justification or a rationalization. He simply said, "Yeah." It was a single syllable that carried the crushing weight of everything he had built, everything he had dismantled, and the decades he would now spend in the cold, sterile environment of federal courtrooms and prison cells accounting for his choices. The call ended with a soft click, leaving Harper alone with the sound of the tide. She stood there for 30 seconds, the phone still gripped in her hand. The ocean moved beside her, indifferent to the high-stakes drama of human betrayal. It was a rhythmic, ancient pulse that grounded her. She didn't rush to call Torres. She didn't reach for her radio. Instead, she tucked the phone into her waistband and finished her run. She needed the physical exertion to process the mental weight. For 2 hours after returning to her apartment, she sat with the conversation. She turned it over in her mind the way she would a piece of unexploded ordnance, carefully, looking for the seams, understanding the mechanism of it. It wasn't that she was hiding the information from Torres. It was that she refused to report anything until she understood exactly what it was. She had been trained to be a sensor, and a sensor was useless if it couldn't distinguish between signal and noise. When the clock hit 10 o'clock a.m., she called Special Agent Torres. She didn't summarize, she didn't interpret. She gave him the conversation word for word, pulled from the ironclad vault of her memory. It was the way she had been trained to report in the field, objective, clinical, and total. When she finished, Torres didn't respond immediately. She could hear the faint scratch of a pen on paper, the sound of a man recording history in real time. "That's going to be useful," he finally said. Harper nodded to the empty room. "I thought it might be." There was a pause, and then Torres's voice shifted. It lost some of its professional distance. "It's a complicated thing," he said, his voice dropping an octave. A man like that calling to say what he said. "It's almost a confession of the soul, not just the crime." "Yes," Harper agreed. It was an admission that the internal compass had been broken long before the external laws were. Torres asked her a question then, one that was not standard for a federal agent. He asked her how she felt about it. Harper took a moment to file that question away. It told her that Torres was seeing her as a person, not just an asset, which was a dangerous but necessary bridge to cross. "I feel like it was honest," she said, her voice reflecting a hard-won clarity. "And I feel like it doesn't change a single thing about what he did. Both of those truths can exist in the same space without canceling each other out." Torres exhaled a breath that sounded like a weary amen. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it works in this job." The machinery of the law began to grind forward with a relentless, mechanical certainty. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday. It wasn't the trial, that was a horizon miles away, but a preliminary federal hearing where the charges would be formally read and the scope of the investigation would be anchored into the official record. Harper was no longer just a woman who had defended herself in a bar. She was the linchpin of a federal case. Through a process that moved with a speed that suggested powerful hands were pushing from behind the scenes, she had acquired legal representation. Patricia Acaffer was a name that carried weight in San Diego. Marsh had described her as a navigator for people who had done the right thing in ways that a motivated prosecutor might call the wrong thing. Patricia was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper intellect. She reviewed the timeline, the incident at Murphy's, the warehouse operation, the team Harper had assembled, the back-channel coordination with Torres, with the analytical efficiency of an architect inspecting a foundation. She sat across from Harper on Wednesday afternoon, her expression unreadable. "Your legal position is solid," Patricia told her. "The self-defense at the bar is backed by video evidence that clearly shows you were targeted. The witness statements are consistent. The subsequent arrests by the feds contextualize the entire incident as part of a predatory pattern. The warehouse, you were operating under the umbrella of a federal investigation. You aren't in legal jeopardy, Harper." There was a pause, the kind a lawyer uses before delivering the news the client doesn't want to hear. "What you are," Patricia continued, "is public." "I know," Harper said, though the full weight of the word hadn't quite settled yet. Patricia shook her head. "No, you don't. The media attention isn't going to fade. When the details of this hearing hit the public record, it's going to explode. You're going to be flooded with requests for interviews and appearances. People are going to try to turn you into a symbol for their own agendas. Some you'll like, some you'll hate. You need to decide what you want to be when you come out the other side of this." Harper sat with that thought long after the call ended. What did she want to be? For 12 years, the answer had been simple. She was a SEAL. She was a weapon in the service of a mission. But now the mission was amorphous. The lines were blurred. She was still sitting in the quiet of her apartment when Danny called at 8:00 p.m. "You watching the news?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," she replied. "Turn it on, Harper. Channel 4. She picked up the remote, and the screen flickered to life. It wasn't a story about the warehouse, at least not directly. It was a deep-dive investigative segment into the broader pattern that Torres's investigation had unearthed. The reporter was speaking in the careful, hedged language of someone who had been vetted by a dozen lawyers, but the picture she was painting was devastating. It was a map of compromised logistics, shell companies, and decommissioned military equipment moving through channels that should have been sealed shut. The reporter was asking the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say. Why hadn't anyone stopped it? Was the failure of detection a matter of incompetence, or was it something more sinister? Was it active? Gerald Finch's name flashed on the screen, a man Harper had already helped put in the crosshairs. Then a second name appeared, a deputy director at a DoD logistics office. But it was the third name that made the world stop spinning. Commander Janet Reyes. The name hit Harper like a physical blow to the solar plexus. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a name in a folder. Janet Reyes had been Harper's commanding officer during her last deployment. She was a woman Harper had respected without reservation, a leader who had been a mentor in a world that didn't offer many of them to women. The text under her name on the screen read, "Placed on administrative leave, NCIS investigation ongoing." Harper stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. Danny's voice was still on the phone, tinny and distant. "You see it?" "I see it," Harper said, her voice flat and cold. "Did you know?" Danny asked. "No," she said. "I had no idea. Does Torres know you have a history with her?" Harper was already reaching for her second phone, the one she used for the investigation. "He does now," she said, and hung up on Danny. Torres answered before the first ring had finished. "I was about to call you," he said, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. "Janet Reyes," Harper said, cutting straight to the bone. "Give me everything." Torres didn't hesitate. Her name popped up in Colt's communication records, he said. "It's not prominent yet, and we haven't established direct operational involvement, but she's there." And she was in a position that gave her total visibility into the channels Colt was using. He paused, and Harper could hear the hesitation. "I need to ask you something directly, Harper. In your time under her command, did you see anything at all, that suggests she was involved in unauthorized transfers?" Harper closed her eyes. She didn't look for emotions, she looked for data. She replayed her time with Reyes with the same meticulous detail she used for pre-mission briefing. Reyes had been sharp. She had been demanding. She had been the kind of officer who made everyone around her better. But then, a memory surfaced. It was a memory that had seemed routine at the time, a bit of administrative friction that she hadn't thought twice about. 3 months ago, Reyes had assigned Harper to an audit of a San Diego logistics firm. She had called it a low-priority routine review. She had even handled the paperwork to ensure Harper's consulting credentials were fast-tracked for that specific contract. The memory settled in her chest like a stone dropped into a deep, still well. The ripples moved outward, chilling everything they touched. She assigned me the audit, Harper said quietly. The silence on Torres's end was deafening. She gave me that contract, Harper continued, her voice gaining a hard edge. The firm was a front company. If she knew what was in those records, then she didn't send me there to find it. She sent you there as a test, Torres finished for her. She wanted to see if you'd noticed the discrepancies. And when you did, and you filed that report and nothing happened, she knew you were a potential exposure. She reported back to Colt that you were a problem. And Colt sent Derek Voss to assess me, Harper said. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of a betrayal so calculated it felt like a violation of the soul. Janet Reyes hadn't just been a corrupt officer. She had used Harper's own integrity as a diagnostic tool. She had taken Harper's loyalty and used it to measure the risk to her own criminal enterprise. I need some time, Harper said, her voice barely a whisper. Take the night, Torres replied. We'll talk in the morning before the hearing. Harper ended the call and sat in the dark. This was her apartment, her sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a cage. This was the first time she had been here since the world had exploded on Thursday. The civilian furniture, the ordinary books on the shelves, the view of the street, it all felt like a costume she was wearing. Danny had once asked her what she missed most about the teams, and she had said clarity. In the field, you knew who was beside you and who was in front of you. Civilian life was nothing but ambiguity. You never truly knew what anything was. Tonight, that ambiguity had been stripped away, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of betrayal. She didn't know if Reyes had started as a hero and been corrupted by degrees, or if she had been a predator all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. It didn't matter. The result was the same. She called Walter. He answered on the first ring, his voice a comfort in the silence. I saw the news, he said. Reyes assigned me the audit, Harper told him. There was a long, heavy silence. Oh, Harper, yeah, how are you doing? Harper actually stopped to think about it. She didn't give the operational status report. She looked inward at the person sitting in the dark. Angry, she said, tired and clear. I'm very clear, Walter. I know what I have to do tomorrow and I know how to do it. Everything else, I'll figure that out later. That's my girl, Walter said softly. She slept for 6 hours. It was the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that had hit its absolute limit and surrendered to the necessity of repair. When she woke at 5:30 a.m., she felt like a machine that had been recalibrated. She ran 4 miles, showered, and dressed in the clothes Patricia had recommended, professional, composed, the visual language of a woman who was a credible witness and a formidable adversary. She was in Patricia's office by 8:00 a.m. The lawyer looked at her and nodded. You look like you slept. I did, Harper said. Good. You're going to need that strength today. The federal courthouse in San Diego was a fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by a sea of reporters. Patricia had warned her, but the physical reality was something else. 24 cameras, twice as many microphones, and the sound of her name being shouted from every direction. It was a cacophony of interest, a wall of noise that she had to walk through. She kept her eyes locked on the horizon, her face a mask of neutral professionality. It was the only way to handle a situation she hadn't been trained for, use the things she had been trained for and hope they were enough. Patricia's hand was firm on her elbow, steering her through the crowd. Don't stop. Don't look. We're inside in 30 seconds. It took 28. Inside, the air was cooler, filtered, and silent. Torres met them in the hallway. He looked like a man who had been living on caffeine and spite for 48 hours straight. He had a thick folder under his arm. Reyes? Harper asked immediately. She has counsel, Torres said. She hasn't been charged yet. That's a separate track, a deeper dive. Today is about Colt, the network, and the warehouse. Reyes is just the background radiation for now. Can you keep it contained to what we're doing today? Harper looked him in the eye. I'm a SEAL, Torres. Compartmentalization isn't just a skill, it's a lifestyle. A small, grim smile touched Torres's lips. Good, let's go. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. Harper sat in the gallery for most of it, watching the legal system do its slow, methodical work. When she was called to the stand, the room went silent. She took the oath and sat in the witness chair, speaking with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. The federal prosecutor walked her through the week. Murphy's Tavern, the phone calls, the assembly of her team, the coordination with Torres, the breach of the warehouse. She answered every question directly, refusing to editorialize or perform for the room. When the defense attorney for one of Colt's associates tried to paint her as a vigilante, a civilian who had contaminated a federal investigation with cowboy tactics, Patricia stood up to object, but Torres's team was already moving. They produced the coordination logs, the timestamps of her communications with federal agents, and the legal authorizations that had been in place before the first door was kicked in. The judge looked at the defense attorney with a look of pure, unadulterated boredom that said more than any verbal reprimand ever could. When it was over, Harper walked out of the courthouse. The reporters were still there, a pack of wolves that had been waiting for the main course. This time, Patricia didn't steer her away. She stopped at the top of the steps and looked at Harper. 30 seconds, she whispered. Your words, then we leave. Harper stood before the cameras, the microphones thrust toward her like spears. She waited until the shouting died down, until the only sound was the clicking of shutters. I was a Navy SEAL for 12 years, she began, her voice carrying across the plaza without the need for a microphone. The training I received was paid for by the American people, and it was intended for the defense of the American people. What happened last week was an application of that training for exactly the purpose it was designed for. I did not act alone. I acted with people I trust in coordination with the law. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I want to be clear. The network that was moving these weapons didn't fail because of one person. It failed because multiple people made the decision to stay in the fight. Some are in custody. Some are being investigated. The work isn't finished, but it's moving. She stepped back and Patricia guided her to the car. Madison was waiting in the back seat. She didn't say a word, she just handed Harper a coffee, the specific blend from the shop near Madison's place that Harper had loved since they were roommates. They drove away from the courthouse, the cameras fading into the distance. After 2 blocks, Madison finally spoke. How do you feel? Harper held the coffee with both hands, watching San Diego roll by. Like it's not over, she said. It's not, Madison replied, but the part you had to do, that part's done. Harper thought of Ray's. I know, she said. That's going to be harder to live with than Colt. Madison reached over and squeezed her hand. I know it is. They drove in silence, the weight of the week finally beginning to settle. Danny and Kai had already headed back to their lives, Danny to Phoenix, Kai to Seattle. They had stepped out of their civilian worlds for 4 days without a single question, and they had stepped back into them with the same uncomplicated loyalty. Brianna had sent a final message at midnight, all data transferred to Torres. Her involvement was officially erased from the record. Her last line was simple. Same team always. Harper's phone buzzed. It was Torres. It went well, he said. The judge issued the holds. The trial is going to be a long haul, but we have the foundation. He paused, and Harper could feel the shift in his tone again. Harper, the deputy director from the DUD, the one on leave, he's decided to cooperate. Harper sat up straighter. How cooperative? Very, Torres said. He has records going back 14 months. He has names. He can link the Finch connection directly to a member of the Armed Services Committee. This is going to go very high, Harper. I want you to be ready. How high? She asked. Torres said a name. It was a name Harper recognized from the nightly news, a name that carried the weight of national policy. She was silent for 3 seconds, staring out at the ordinary Friday morning traffic. The corruption wasn't just a localized infection. It was a systemic rot that reached into the very heart of the power structure. Okay, she said. Okay, Torres repeated. It's bigger than I thought, she said, her voice regaining its steady operational rhythm. But the approach doesn't change. You have the evidence, you have the witnesses, you have everything you need. Because of you, Torres said. Because of a team, she corrected him. When she hung up, Madison was watching her. What did he say? Harper looked at her oldest friend, the woman who had seen her through deployments, through the transition to civilian life, and through the chaos of the last week. It's bigger, Harper said, but it's going to be all right. Madison studied her face for a long time. She saw the exhaustion, but she also saw the purpose. I believe you, she said. The car moved through the city, and for a moment the ocean appeared between the high rises, a vast, blue, indifferent expanse. Harper took a sip of her coffee. The stitches in her scalp were healing. The deep bruises on her ribs were fading to a dull yellow. Her body was doing exactly what it was designed to do: repair, adapt, and move forward. She thought about what Patricia had asked her, what she wanted to be on the other side of this. She knew now that there was no going back to the quiet, muted life she had been trying to build. That door hadn't just been closed, it had been blown off its hinges. But she wasn't going back to the teams either. That was a different life, a different version of herself. There was a middle ground, a space where her skills and her morality could exist in a world that desperately needed both. Torres had said the work wasn't finished. He was right. The investigation would take months, maybe years. The threads they were pulling would lead to dark places that required a specific kind of light to navigate. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Brianna. "Are you interested in making this more permanent?" The reply came back in less than a minute. "I've been waiting for you to ask." She sent the same message to Danny. His response was equally fast. "Obviously, yes, Phoenix is boring." Kai's response took 4 minutes, already packed. She looked at the screen. 4 people. A 71-year-old Master Chief with a bad knee and the best filing system in the Western Hemisphere. A federal agent who had learned that Harper Dalton was the most reliable asset he would ever have. It wasn't a team in any official sense. It had no badge, no government funding, no oversight committee. It was something more primal. It was a group of people who had looked into the abyss together and hadn't blinked. Madison watched her put the phone away. "You're going to keep doing this, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harper said. "Is it going to be dangerous?" "Probably." Madison was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. "Are you going to tell me when it is?" Harper looked at her friend. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll always call you when it's over." Madison nodded, a slow, solemn movement. She had accepted years ago that loving Harper Dalton meant accepting the warrior along with the woman. "Deal," she said. The car pulled up to Madison's building. The October air was crisp, smelling of salt and the coming rain. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the kind of sky that follows a storm. Inside, there would be breakfast, a real meal, the kind that reminded you why you fought to stay alive. There would be coffee and the easy, comfortable warmth of a friendship that had survived every trial. Harper stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the sky. She hadn't just survived the week, she had reclaimed herself. Her corner of the world was measurably better. Weapons that would have fueled violence were in crates in a federal lockup. A network of shadows had been dragged into the light of a courtroom. 5 men who had made the mistake of thinking she was an easy target were learning the full extent of their error. She had been built for this. Every mile she had run, every hour she had spent in the dark, every sacrifice she had made in the name of the teams. It hadn't been for a war that ended. It had been for the ongoing, unglamorous, necessary work of standing in the gap. She was a woman of precision and discipline, and she would no longer apologize for the machinery of her soul. She followed Madison inside, her pace steady and her mind already moving toward the next objective. The work wasn't finished, and Harper Dalton had never been a woman to leave a job half done. The hallway of Madison's apartment building was quiet, the carpet muffling their footsteps. It was a stark contrast to the flashbulbs and the shouting of the courthouse steps. Here, in the mundane world of residence and rent, Harper felt like a ghost returning to the living. But she wasn't a ghost. She was more alive than she had been in 2 years. The dull ache in her ribs was a reminder of her mortality, but the clarity in her mind was a testament to her purpose. As Madison unlocked her door, the scent of fresh-baked bread and expensive coffee wafted out. This was the life Harper had tried to fit into, a world of aesthetics and comfort. It was a beautiful world, one she would fight to protect, but it was no longer a world she could inhabit fully. She was a guardian at the gate, and the gate was always moving. Inside, the apartment was bathed in the soft, golden light of the morning. Madison went straight to the kitchen, her movements practiced and fluid. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing toward the heavy oak table. "You need to eat something that didn't come out of a vending machine or a tactical pouch." Harper sat, her hands resting flat on the table's surface. She felt the grain of the wood, the solid reality of it. For the next hour, they didn't talk about the hearing or the due or the names on the news. They talked about the things that had kept their friendship alive for over a decade. Books they hadn't finished, mutual friends who were getting married, the absurdity of the San Diego housing market. It was a necessary tether to the earth. It was the home that Walter had talked about. But even as she laughed at Madison's story about a disastrous date, a part of Harper's mind was still processing the data. She was thinking about the logistics of setting up a secure communication line for the team. She was thinking about Walter's files and how they could be integrated with Brianna's digital reach. She was thinking about Janet Ray's and the specific, cold betrayal of an officer who had traded her honor for a ledger of shell companies. When breakfast was over and the coffee was down to the dregs, Madison leaned back in her chair. "You're already planning the next thing, aren't you?" Harper didn't try to deny it. "I have to be Madison. This doesn't stop because a few men are in handcuffs. The network is still there. The people who bought those weapons, the people who facilitated the transfers, they're still out there." Madison nodded slowly. "I know, I want you to be careful." Harper looked at her, really looked at her. "I am careful, Madison. I'm the most careful person you know. It's the careless ones who get people killed." Madison smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know, that's what scares me. You're so good at this that you'll never find a reason to stop." Harper didn't have an answer for that because she knew it was true. The work was the reason. The purpose was the reason. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city she had chosen as her home. It was a beautiful, complicated, broken place, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number, encrypted and routed through 3 different servers. Harper recognized the digital signature immediately. It was Brianna. "Found something in the Finch records. You're not going to like it. When can we talk?" Harper typed back a single word: "Now." She turned to Madison, who was already clearing the table. "I have to go," she said. Madison stopped, a plate in her hand. She didn't ask where, she didn't ask why. She just looked at Harper and nodded. "Call me when you can." "I will," Harper promised. She walked out of the apartment and into the bright, salt-edged morning. The sun was higher now, the shadows shortening. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the weight of the secrets it held, and the weight of the responsibility she had reclaimed. She wasn't just a former SEAL. She wasn't just a consultant. She was a woman who had stopped running from the truth of what she was. As she reached her car, she took one last look at the ocean. It was a deep, restless blue, forever in motion, forever pushing against the shore. It was a force of nature, governed by its own laws, and it never, ever stopped. Harper Dalton got behind the wheel and started the engine. She had work to do, and for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly how to do it. The city moved around her, a blur of traffic and life. She drove toward the address Brianna had sent, a nondescript office building in a part of town that didn't get much foot traffic. It was the kind of place where things happened quietly, out of sight of the cameras and the reporters. It was the kind of place where the real work began. As she drove, she thought about Colt's last words. He had asked her what the difference was between them. She had given him the professional answer, the one about training and belief. But there was a deeper answer, one she hadn't been ready to say out loud. The difference was that she hadn't let the darkness change her. She had looked into the same abyss, seen the same corruption, and felt the same pull of cynicism. But she had chosen to remain a light. Not a bright, blinding light, but a steady, focused beam that cut through the fog. She pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence of the car was absolute. She took a breath, letting it out slowly, feeling the tension in her body settle into a state of readiness. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were clear, her face composed. She looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was. She stepped out of the car and headed toward the building. The air was cool, the sun warm on her back. The world was full of noise and chaos and betrayal, but in this moment, in this place, there was only the mission, and the mission was enough. Harper Dalton walked through the doors and into the next chapter of her life. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her but a life she had outgrown and a war she had finished. Ahead of her was a new kind of fight, one that didn't have a front line or a uniform. It was a fight for the soul of the things she believed in, and she was more than ready for it. The elevator climbed silently toward the top floor. When the doors opened, Brianna was waiting. She looked tired, her eyes red from hours of staring at screens, but she was vibrating with the same intensity Harper felt. "You need to see this," Brianna said, turning and leading the way into a room filled with monitors and hardware. Harper followed her, her mind already analyzing the data points on the screens. She saw the names, the dates, the financial trails that led from a bar in Coronado to the highest levels of government. She saw the scope of the betrayal, and she felt the familiar, cold resolve settle over her. "This is just the beginning," Brianna whispered, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Harper stood beside her, watching the truth unfold in lines of code and scanned documents. "Yes, it is," Harper said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the room, "and we're going to see it through to the end." The work was not finished. It might never be finished. But as the sun climbed higher over the Pacific, Harper Dalton knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone in the dark. She had her team, she had her purpose, and she had the absolute refusal to be anything less than what she was built to be. The mission was active, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be.